out with my rant today from HartmannReport.com. Why would anybody embrace fascism? And, you know, I realize that there have been historically, not historically, but, you know, over the last couple of decades, there have been basically kind of two camps about what's animating the hard right. What's animating the Republican Party? What's animating the GOP's base? And one camp argues that they're just all racists. You know, this is the leftover of Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan's Southern strategy, combined with, you know, George Herbert Walker Bush's Willie Horton ad, and then Donald Trump, the Mexican rapists are coming, and asshole countries, and keep out the Muslims with his Muslim ban, and all that stuff is added up to just this massive flow of racism. That said, I remember a time when, you know, I mean, growing up in lower middle class Lansing, where you know, all the white people that I knew had good jobs. They were working at Fisher Body or General Motors. They were making cars. They were making, you know, good money, $30 an hour, which was a lot back then. They had good benefits. And yeah, they were probably mostly racists, but they weren't voting for racists. They weren't, you know, carrying around Confederate flags. They weren't strapping AR-15s to their chest and strutting around like street gangs. You know, threatening people's lives. What's the difference? What happened? What brought the racists out of the woodwork? And in this article, basically, I lay out this hypothesis, which, you know, I've shared with you in the past, but I think, you know, it's worth revisiting from time to time. That what is, you know, in fact, all over social media, people are asking, why would anybody embrace fascism? I mean, because that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about fascism. There's this worldwide movement toward fascism. Rachel Maddow opened her show with it last night on MSNBC, and I thought it was absolutely brilliant. I watched it on the plane from Salt Lake City here. We had a stopover. And I think it's safety. You know, on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, at the very bottom, of course, is homeostasis. You need to breathe, you need to drink water, you need to, you know, be able to do bodily functions, basically, maintain your body temperature, stuff like that. But right above that is safety. You know, if you're crossing a street and all of a sudden cars are whizzing by you in both directions, you're not thinking about, you know, what you're going to have for dinner or what you want to do with your career goals or you know, whether you should propose to that to your new girlfriend or what. I mean, what you're thinking about is, how do I avoid getting hit by a car? And what has happened over the last 40 years as part of the Reagan Revolution and in response to the Powell memo, Lewis Powell's memo, is that there has been this huge right-wing infrastructure built, and I would call it a neo-fascist infrastructure, frankly, because they're all promoting fascism. Not necessarily pure Nazism, but something damn close. And, you know, that includes 1,500 right-wing radio stations, that includes, I mean, if you look at the top podcasts, the top 100 podcasts, like the top 40 of them, at least 2/3 of them are right-wing podcasts. There's enormous money behind these. They promote them like crazy. They on social media, they get promotion. You've also got, you know, the owners and people running many of the social media sites are themselves billionaires and conservatives, and so they're pushing these memes as well. And so now what you have is kind of latent racism that has had a fire lit under it by the destruction of the American middle class. We've gone, and largely the white middle class, although since the 60s there was a growing black middle class and a Hispanic middle class as well. And all have taken a hit. The blacks and Hispanics have been hit harder than the whites, but the whites have been hit hard enough that, you know, the middle class in America has gone from 65% of us when Reagan came into office to 45% of us today. So you've got, you know, that 20% that got screwed, you know, the title of one of my books, The Undeclared War on the Middle Class. And these people who have literally, not literally been screwed if you use the you know, some of the definitions, but I'd say, you know, financially they've been screwed. And, you know, they know it, they're just not sure why. And so you've got this huge media structure around the country that, you know, that kind of started with Limbaugh on radio. It started with Rupert Murdoch, the Australian billionaire, on television. that have a very simple answer for these largely white people who have been financially screwed by 40 years of Reaganism. They're saying, okay, who did this to me? Why does my job pay half of what I paid in 1980? And the answer these people will say is, oh, it's because black people want your job. It's because brown-skinned immigrants want your job. It's because women want your job. And if we could just go back to, pre-1965, when women had to have a man's permission to get a credit card or open a checking account, when women generally could not enter the workforce unless it was a secretary, when black people were relegated to very specific jobs, janitors and things like that, and by and large separated from the rest of society. We had segregated water fountains. We still had segregated schools. If we could just go back to that, society would stabilize itself. This was Russell Kirk's great theory. He wrote a book about this called The Conservative Mind, From Burke to Eliot. And it starts out with Edmund Burke. And Edmund Burke was the famous British conservative philosopher, political economist back in the late 1700s, who wrote that, it does me no harm if a man is allowed to engage in a profession as servile as that of hairdresser or candlemaker, but it does society considerable violence if such a man is allowed to vote. I'm slightly paraphrasing, but that's pretty close to the exact quote. And this perspective has been adopted by the Republican Party. And now they've reached the logical end of this. They're actually openly, nakedly, enthusiastically promoting fascism in the United States. And they've got this whole network of right-wing billionaires behind them that are also pushing fascism in this country. And they've also got, all these radio stations and podcasts and everything. Interesting, I believe it was the Brennan Center did this study. It was published last week. I mentioned this briefly on Friday, that some of these right-wing podcasts are 11 times more likely to have lies in them than our left-wing podcasts. 11 times. That's 11,000%, right? Or 1,100% more lies. And, you wonder why people are acting crazy. You wonder why people are so angry. You wonder why people have gone so nuts. Simple answer is they're being lied to. They're being told that they are not safe. Now, they know financially they're not safe, but they're being told that lack of safety is the result of Democrats, of liberals, of queer people, of black people, and of women. And therefore, they need to go after those people. And thus, we've got all these white guys strutting around with AR-15s strapped across their chests, wearing Confederate flags. Surprise, surprise. What do you think? In addition to bringing you the Thom Hartmann Program here on Free Speech TV and Video Media Online, we also have a whole set of ways you can interact with us and tools you can use to spread the word about the importance of democracy and the threats to it in our republic. First, there's your daily homework. Sue Nethercutt puts together a daily email newsletter that has a link to every story I discuss on the air, so you can find my sources and you can share them with your friends. It's free and you can sign up at thomhartmann.com. Second, I publish my daily take every day over at the hartmannreport.com website. That's also free if you want the daily 5 days a week rant in your inbox. No ads either. Third, we have the podcasts. There's the free 1-hour version of our daily show that's advertising supported. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts normally. And then there's also the podcast of the entire 3-hour show with no advertisements, and that's available by subscription over at thomhartmann.com. So check them all out at thomhartmann.com and hartmannreport.com. Club. Today our book is by Frantz Fanon, and it's The Wretched of the Earth. This is from the chapter on national culture on page 145. It sort of reads like Thomas Paine, actually. Each generation must discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it in relative opacity. In the underdeveloped countries, preceding generations have simultaneously resisted the insidious agenda of colonialism and paved the way for the emergence of the current struggles. Now that we are in the heat of combat, we must shed the habit of decrying the efforts of our forefathers or feigning incomprehension at their silence or passiveness. They fought as best they could with the weapons they possessed at the time, and if their struggle did not reverberate throughout the international arena, the reason should be attributed not so much to a lack of heroism, but to a fundamentally different international situation. More than one colonized subject had to say, "We've had enough." More than one tribe had to rebel. More than one peasant revolt had to be quelled. More than one demonstration had to be repressed for us to stand firm, certain of our victory. For those of us who are determined to break the back of colonialism, our historic mission is to authorize every revolt, every desperate act, and every attack aborted or drowned in blood. In this chapter, we'll analyze the fundamental issue of the legitimate claim to a nation. The political party that mobilizes the people, however, is little concerned with this issue of legitimacy. Political parties are concerned solely with daily reality, and it is in the name of this reality, in the name of this immediacy which influences the present and future of men and women, that they make their call to action. The political party may very well speak of the nation in emotional terms, but it is primarily interested in getting the people who are listening to understand that they must join in the struggle if they quite simply want to exist. We now know that in the first phase of the national struggle, colonialism attempts to diffuse nationalist demands by manipulating economic doctrine. At the first sign of a dispute, colonialism feigns comprehension by acknowledging with ostentatious humility that the territory is suffering from serious underdevelopment that requires major social and economic reforms. And it is true that certain spectacular measures, such as the opening of work sites for the unemployed here and there, delay the formation of a national consciousness by a few years. But sooner or later, colonialism realizes it is incapable of achieving a program of socioeconomic reforms that would satisfy the aspirations of the colonized masses. Even when it comes to filling their bellies, colonialism proves to be inherently powerless. The colonial state very quickly discovers that any attempt to disarm the national parties at a purely economic level would be tantamount to practicing in the colonies what it did not want to do in its own territory. And it is no coincidence that today the doctrine of Cartierism is on the rise just about everywhere. Cartier's bitter disillusionment with France's stubborn determination to retain ties with people it will have to feed, whereas so many French citizens are in dire straits, reflects colonialism's inability to transform itself into a non-partisan. The intellectuals place themselves in the context of history. Faced with the colonized intellectuals' debunking of the colonist theory of a pre-colonial barbarism, colonialism's response is mute. It is especially mute since the ideas put forward by the young colonized intelligentsia are widely accepted by metropolitan specialists. It is in fact now commonly recognized that for several decades, numerous European researchers have widely rehabilitated African, Mexican, and Peruvian civilizations. Some have been surprised by the passion invested by the colonized intellectuals in their defense of a national culture. But those who consider this passion exaggerated are strangely apt to forget that their psyches and their egos are conveniently safeguarded by the French or German culture, whose worth has been proven and which has gone unchallenged. I concede the fact that the actual existence of an Aztec civilization has done little to change the diet of today's Mexican peasant. I concede that whatever proof there is of a once mighty Songhai civilization does not change the fact that the Songhais today are undernourished, illiterate, abandoned to the skies and water.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Hey, happy Monday. It's a beautiful day here in Portland. I hope it is wherever you are. I have some thoughts on Jimmy Carter that I will share with you in a few moments. We got a lot to talk about today. There's a lot on the program. We're going to have a couple of just some fantastic conversations I'm very much looking forward to. David Frum will be with us in just a moment, staff writer for The Atlantic, author of 10 books. Well, we'll get to that in just a second. Also, I want to get into my thoughts on Jimmy Carter after David leaves us. And one of my friends, Richard Belzer, a star of Law and Order, just died. His last words are iconic. I'll tell you about that, a little story about that. In the second hour of our program, the head of the Democratic Party in the state of Wisconsin, our old buddy Ben Wickler, is going to drop by about what is, in his opinion, the most important race in America for this year anyway. It's going to set the stage for next year, the Supreme Court race there. Also, the Republican plan to drive more Americans deeper into poverty has been revealed. And Marjorie Taylor Greene, has she become a useful troll for Keven McCarthy? Is she like switching sides? Weird stuff going on. Naomi Oreskes is going to drop by in the third hour. She's got a new book about how how corporations hooked America on the myth of the so-called magic of the marketplace, an old Friedmanism. Crazy alert, Fox News thinks diversity is the cause of the Ohio train derailment. Alex Jones warns everyone liberals are eating babies. Oh, great fun. We'll talk about that in the third hour. And a geeky science. What will America find out when the first GMO trees are planted in our forests? Klebsiella planticola gives us a cautionary tale. But to start out, David Frum is on the line with us. He's the author of 10 books, most recently Trumpocalypse, Restoring American Democracy. Former speechwriter, special assistant to President George W. Bush, excuse me. His most recent piece for The Atlantic is absolutely fascinating. It's titled, "The GOP Is Just Obnoxious." David, welcome back to the program. Been a while since we've talked. I'm glad you could join us.
Hello again.
Yeah. So your argument, I mean, you know, you go through Dr. Oz being a jerk and multiple others throughout the Republican Party. What is it specifically that, in your opinion, is causing so many Americans to turn against the Republican Party? I mean, it sounds like you think that it's all this obnoxious performance art that they're doing, owning the libs, which doesn't seem to be a thing on the left, of owning the cons, you know?
Right. Well, I opened the piece by telling the story of what happened to Dr. Oz in the 2022 Senate race in Pennsylvania. Dr. Oz was not a crazy choice of candidate for the Republicans. He would have been, if elected, the first Muslim in the U.S. Senate, as far as we know, which would have been an important act of diversity for the Republican Party. He started his career as an extremely eminent heart surgeon, with a dozen patents to his credit that have really changed and improved the treatment of heart disease. Then he went into a career as a TV pitchman, and while I personally don't approve of what he was doing, there's no question that millions of people found it deeply meaningful. And so maybe he wouldn't get my vote, but he would get the vote of millions of people who'd seen him on TV and trusted him and admired him thanks to his magazines and TV shows. He was charismatic, he was good, he was handsome, and he was trying to find his way to a kind of moderate politics. So he sometimes got himself in trouble by tripped over his feet on the abortion issue by trying to be all things to all people, but he was not a fanatic. However, he was running against someone who had chronic health problems, which exploded into a stroke during the campaign, John Fetterman. And at that point, as someone with this huge medical reputation, Dr. Oz had an opportunity. He could have struck a compassionate tone. He could have said something that would have shown people in Pennsylvania that he was, he was a Republican, sure, but he had a heart, he cared for people, and he could have been gracious. And instead, he trolled and trolled and trolled and trolled, and he lost the race, a winnable race for him, by 4 points. So I tell that story as a way of illustrating that even when, other things are going right for you, this is a country of basically decent people. Most people are basically decent. If you show them decency in yourself, that's a plus. Most successful candidates try to look like someone you'd like. But there's been this imperative in the Trump years among Republicans to show yourself as someone who most people would not like.
Why do you think that is? I mean, we could get into a conversation about, how Buckley and Bellotti, these two decisions in the 70s, altered the Republican Party, certainly the Reagan administration. And then, Clinton in 92 kind of jumped into the same thing, and it distorted the Democratic Party for a number of years. I think the Democratic Party's recovering, the Republican Party's not so much. They're still kind of in the thrall of corporate money, but that doesn't explain just being a dick. Why is it that and I think most of us, well, I don't know how many people grew up being bullied as a kid. I mean, I certainly did. I was a skinny, geeky kid, it seems to me like they've become the party of bullies. Like this is their highest value now. is either insecure men strutting around with giant guns, giant synthetic penises strapped to their chests, or Marjorie Taylor Greene trying to own the libs and talk about how Democrats hate America. I mean, where is this coming from? Is this just a reflection of Donald Trump, or is this deeper and older?
No, I invite people, especially those of us who are middle-aged or older, conjure up in your mind your mental images of successful winning politicians. Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, Obama. What do you see them doing in your mind? They're probably doing something that looks affable, pleasant. Reagan's chuckle, Clinton's down-home charm, Jimmy Carter's million-watt smile. Obama had his whole face would light up. George W. Bush, famously personable. That's, whether you agreed with them or not, you could see they were trying to be someone whom most people would find attractive. Now ask yourself, did you ever see Donald Trump smiling except when he was thinking of the suffering of somebody else?
Yeah, seriously.
And have you ever seen, say, Ron DeSantis looking like he's even having any kind of good day, even on his own terms? And I think this does have something to do with Trump. And it has something to do with the Republican inability to process what a fluky bit of good luck Donald Trump had in 2016. So if you think about the elections since the year 2000, there have been 6 presidential elections, 12 major party nominees. If you stack them by share of the popular vote, Donald Trump ranks 10th and 11th. Only John McCain did worse in 2008, and he was running as basically an incumbent in the worst economy since the Great Depression and during the worst war since Vietnam.
Right.
So he's and that's not his fault, but he's a special case. He's got like all the wind in his face. Trump was a uniquely unpopular candidate, but he kept insisting he'd won this historic victory. Republicans pretended, or some of them genuinely believed him, and they thought, okay, he's found something about America that no one ever knew before, which is you can be rewarded for being a dick. Except it turns out that wasn't true. You don't get rewarded for being a dick. And the record of 2018, when Republicans lose the House, 2020, when they lose the presidency, 2021, when they lose the Senate, 2022, when they have the worst up and down the ballot result for the out party since the New Deal. And this is one of the other points in the piece. I don't think, the Republicans gained the House of Representatives in 2022, just barely, but they did. So people think they must have had a good election. Except then you look at the whole ballot and think, wait. They net loss of 1 in the Senate, net loss of 2 governorships. Of the 99 state legislatures, Nebraska has only a single chamber. So there 49 states have 2 chambers, Nebraska has 1, that makes 99. Normally, when the president's not on the ballot, the party of the president loses state legislatures. That's an almost iron law of American politics. You have to go back to the 1930s to find a time when the party of the president did not lose a state legislature. In 2022, the Democrats gained 4 chambers. That's a remarkable result, and a lot of it has to do with just unpleasant behavior.
Wow. So we're speaking with David Frum, the author of Trumpocalypse, Restoring American Democracy, and he's got a new piece out, The GOP Is Just Obnoxious, that you can find at theatlantic.com. And David, we have about two and a half minutes here before we hit a hard break I can't control. Where does the Republican Party, I mean, if there was a consensus across the Republican Party that running as a jerk is just like not the thing that's going to work anymore, where do they go? I mean, you've got Republicans struggling with whether they should be open about trying to, privatize Social Security and Medicare. Yeah. You've got, Republicans openly talking about, in fact, introducing legislation to subject women to lethal injection if they leave the state to get an abortion. I mean, it's like I don't see any positions that are that are at the front of this party that can win elections.
There are elections, there are issues for Republicans. Crime. We've been seeing a substantial uptick in crime since 2014 and dramatically so since 2020. Public disorder. I mean, you're in Portland. I mean, that Portland is a less orderly place than it was half a dozen years ago. Los Angeles, San Francisco, other great cities. Now, these are not necessarily federal issues, but there is. And
they're not necessarily the fault of Democrats. I mean, we just came through the worst pandemic in history.
It doesn't matter whose fault it is. It matters who's in charge when the problem happens.
Well, that's true.
And the other party gets it. Another issue that is available to Republicans, we have seen a huge drive by Democratic local governments to get rid of tracking and streaming and honors programs in schools, standing up for excellence in education. There are issues. But first, as the rule of politics is, people don't care what you know until they know what you care. Be someone whom people like, and then talk to them about where they live.
Yeah, but it seems, I mean, here we have on Fox News, the Ohio train wreck is because Biden hates white people, right? I mean,
right, that's not going to work. But but championing people where they are. There's always an impulse for that. There's always this is a country with potential conservative support always.
No, I totally get that.
People emotionally first.
Yeah, I totally get that. And yet, campaigning, building your identity around trying to insert yourself into the private lives of women who want to have an abortion, or people who want to express a different gender, live as a different gender. It seems the antithesis of the leave me alone small government Republicans.
Well, I think they will discover there is always inventory in politics. There are always issues. Yeah. Politics is an exam where the questions always change because the needs of society always change. There's always political opportunity. But you have to begin by showing people you care about them. Yeah. No one wants to send someone to the State House, to the mayor's office, to Congress they feel doesn't like and trust them.
Yeah, totally get it. David Frum, a very thought-provoking piece. I highly recommend it. It's over at The Atlantic. The GOP is just obnoxious. And, of course, his new book, Trumpocalypse, Restoring American Democracy. David, thanks for dropping by. Great seeing you. We'll be right back. Jimmy Carter reflects the best of America. I'll tell you about that after the break.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Talk media for the rest of us. We'll be right back. Stick around. And welcome back. Marvin in Belvedere, Illinois. Hey, Marvin, what's on your mind today? Thanks for watching us on Free Speech TV.
Well, I wanted to bring up that thing. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, I can now. Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to bring up that thing over with Ukraine, and
you need to turn down your TV, Marvin. It'll make you crazy.
Yeah, I know. I'm trying to get it down right now. Sorry.
So you wanted to talk about Joe Biden being in Ukraine and meeting with President Zelensky this morning?
Yeah. I'm glad he's trying to help out Ukraine. But it seems like he kind of, well, people on Fox News would say he slow walks it. He doesn't give the help to them as fast as they need it. You know what I mean?
I do. I think that, we've put about $30 or $40 billion worth of weaponry, by and large, into Ukraine, which is huge. I think without our help, they would have probably fallen a long time ago. And yet, the other thing he's trying to balance is, he doesn't want to expand this war. He doesn't want it to, he doesn't want the Russians to have an excuse to say, this is just a proxy war, and now we're going to go after Poland or something. Although now they're going after Moldova. I don't know if you saw that news. Which is this little slice of land between Ukraine and Poland, if my memory of geography is correct. And, that
government... Not reading up on that too much.
Yeah, that government just fell, But go ahead.
Don't you think our president is a little too worried about offending Putin?
No, I don't think so.
About him?
I think he's more concerned about the Republican Party. You've got now, last week you had 11 Republicans in the House of Representatives, all of them, notorious traitors who were big supporters of the January 6th insurrection, Marjorie Taylor Greene among them, and Matt Gaetz, that crowd, Paul Gosar, Andy Biggs and company, introducing legislation to stop all U.S. aid to Ukraine. And, I think that probably is the thing that he, if he's looking over his shoulder, I think it's more that than anything else. Marvin, thanks for the call. It's nice to hear from you. Jose in Toledo, Ohio. Hey, Jose, what's on your mind this morning?
Well, Tom, I've been writing some editorials for La Prensa, his bilingual newspaper for Ohio, Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan. And the owner is a friend of mine, and we were talking the other day, and he hit me with a question that stumped me. Like, I know what neoliberalism and I know what conservatism is. I see the picture of what it does. But he asked me for a concise definition, and I was wondering if you could give me a
one sentence?
A definition.
Yeah, neoliberalism is a political and economic philosophy that asserts markets should control democracies rather than democracies controlling markets.
All right.
And thus, if the market is controlling the democracy, the largest players in the marketplace would be the ones who are essentially controlling the democracy, which are the largest corporations of the richest people. And that's what we've had since Reagan.
Yeah, since towards the end of Jimmy Carter, right?
Yep. Yeah, Jimmy Carter was the last non-neoliberal president, until Joe Biden. And even, Joe Biden's got a few neoliberal bones, but he's finally we're repudiating it, neoliberalism. Trump gave voice to repudiating neoliberalism, but he never actually did anything. Jose, great question. Thank you so much for the call. We'll be right back. Change starts with you. You can be calling your Democratic or Republican representatives to let them know what you think by calling 202-224-3121. It's the Capitol switchboard. It'll get you right through to them. Well, it appears that American business has a cranky right-wing billionaire problem. This is really getting bad. Tesla fired dozens of their workers at their Buffalo, New York plant after the workers sent an email to Elon Musk, the owner, principal owner of Tesla, notifying him that they were going to start unionizing or a campaign to create a union for the company. So he just went and fired them all. Meanwhile, over at Starbucks, the interim CEO, Howard Schultz, another billionaire, is basically telling Bernie Sanders and the committee that he is the chairman of in the United States Senate, the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, to go screw themselves. He just said he's not going to do it. He's not going to show up. Bernie says apparently it's easier for Schultz to fire workers who are exercising their constitutional right to form a union than it is to answer questions from elected officials. There's a video about it over at ThomHartmann.com. Check it out. And welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, and talking about Jimmy Carter for a moment. Jimmy Carter has gone into hospice care right now, and so how is that going to play out? What's going to happen? With him and his life, I guess none of us know for sure. But I wanted to share some thoughts on Jimmy Carter that I think are really pretty important. First of all, Jimmy Carter was the first president in my lifetime, I believe. I'm trying to think if Harry Truman was, Harry Truman was president for a year during my lifetime, so I guess he was the second president in my lifetime to propose a national health care program. He wanted a national health care insurance program that paid all the medical expenses of all Americans above the first $2,500 a year. Kind of a single-payer program. He also tried to stop climate change. And, we've talked about that many times on this program. I've played the clips for you. I'm not going to play them at length right now. He was one of those rare Christians who actually believed and lived the words of Jesus, which was amazing. He was the victim of one of America's most notorious political crimes, Ronald Reagan cutting a deal with the Ayatollah to hang on to the hostages so that Jimmy Carter would lose the election of 1980. He won the Nobel Peace Prize, for his work in the Middle East, which was just extraordinary. I mean, the things that this man did. He was a nuclear scientist who, at the age of 28, stopped one of North America's worst nuclear meltdowns, or what could have been. He actually lowered himself into a reactor that was in the process or on the verge of melting down, and saved the capital of Canada, Ottawa, when he was 28 years old in the Navy. He was exposed to so much radiation that his urine was testing as radioactive for 6 months after that. And, he writes about it in his autobiography. I mean, talk about a badass, right? This man is plus, he came on my program and said, like, speaking of Citizens United.
It violates the essence of what made America a great country in its political system. Now it's just an oligarchy with unlimited political bribery being the essence of getting the nominations for president or the elected president.
And he went on from there. Jimmy, we wish you well. We pray for your gentle and beautiful passing into the light, and support for Rosalind and the family. We'll be back with your calls on the other side of the break.
Listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Also, President Biden met with President Zelensky in Kyiv this morning. Talk about courage. I'll briefly speak about that on the other side of the break, and then pick up your calls.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Separated by the Border, a birth mother, a foster mother, and a migrant child's 3,000-mile journey by Gina Thomas. This is from the introduction. How good is your Spanish? And would you be able to take in a 4-year-old girl? She's from Honduras and speaks minimal English. The social worker had texted me on a Friday afternoon. I sat at my desk, bent over my cell phone, reading and rereading the text. My thoughts traveled to Honduras, bachata, ballades, clothes hanging on the line. So many things in our lives seem to have prepared us for this moment. My son was attending a bilingual school. I'm a former ESL teacher, and my husband Andrew and I speak Spanish. Plus, Honduras already had a piece of my heart. As those thoughts came, I tried to push them away. The voice of logic came in loud and strong. We had just gotten into a routine with Emma, our foster daughter. 2 foster children and 2 biological children would be too much for us to handle. Our first month as foster parents taught us this, and for the sake of everyone involved, we knew it would be very unfair to try that again. A little later, the social worker called and left me a message saying, "It looks like the Office of Refugee Resettlement, the ORR, and Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, will get her on Monday in court. It'll only be the weekend. Call me back after you talk to Andrew." I asked Andrew when I got home, "We can manage 4 kids for one weekend, right?" He said he doubted it would last only a weekend, but I convinced him that if ORR and ICE were involved, they would get her on Monday. A few minutes later, I called our social worker and said that we'd do it. When I walked into the social worker's office, Julia was sitting there in a brand new bright pink Barbie t-shirt. The social worker said they'd found the t-shirt in their clothing closet and Julia wanted it. Beautiful, soft onyx curls framed the girl's umber face. Her dark complexion made me speculate she was from a coastal region. She stood in dirty flip-flops next to the social worker's chair, chit-chatting away in Spanish without a care in the world. "Julia's been talking my ear off," the social worker said. "She's so sweet, but I have no idea what she's saying." Another worker brought in a black tote bag with a few other items from the clothing closet, including a pair of sequined high-top sneakers that Julia had picked out. I began to speak to Julia, pronounced Julia, in Spanish. She seemed happy to hear her mother tongue, but her body language didn't budge. I read that signal loud and clear, so I kept my distance and sat down on the floor. "¿Cómo se llama?" I asked. "Julia." "¿Cuántos años tienes?" "How old are you?" "Cuatro," 4. She looked older than 4 to me. I had been told her parents were deported and she was left behind. She was under federal jurisdiction. I would find out later this was all misinformation. I signed some papers and said, "We'll see you on Monday." I asked Julia if she would come stay with me and my family for the weekend. She smiled. I told her I had 3 other kids. Her eyes expanded with excitement. On the drive home, she jolted my Spanish from its slumber. The social worker wasn't kidding about how much this little one talked. On April 6, 2018, U.S. Attorney General Jeff Sessions announced a new zero-tolerance policy in which the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice would partner for the sake of prosecuting illegal entry into the United States. Sessions said, quote, If you cross this border unlawfully, then we will prosecute you. It's that simple. If you smuggle aliens across our border, then we will prosecute you. If you are smuggling a child, then we will prosecute you, and that child will be separated from you as required by law. If you don't like that, then don't smuggle children over our border." End quote. 6 weeks later, almost 2,000 children had been separated from their parents at the border since the zero-tolerance policy took effect. When Sessions announced the administration's new policy, I couldn't comprehend the cruelty. I also wondered if it explained why a preschooler was living under my roof. Julia had come to live with me and my family in February of 2018, and it felt surreal to be a part of her story. She had first been separated from her mother, Guadalupe, called by her nickname Lupe through the rest of this book, by smugglers who were paid to bring them across the border. Julia had then been separated from her stepfather, Carlos, by U.S. Customs and Border Protection, likely because what was recognized by the Honduran government as stepfather was not recognized by the U.S. government as the same, a detail I didn't understand until an immigration expert read the first draft of this book and explained it. Julia had already suffered much trauma, and separating her from her stepfather had only inflicted more. The weight of the trauma that we, as a nation, began inflicting on vulnerable children and their parents was cruel and unusual punishment. When I heard that my own country was going to begin separating children regularly from their parents as a policy, it broke me. Reality became surreal, and Andrew and I learned to live in it, separating the trauma from our emotions so that we could survive. As the veil of Oz is ever lifting from my white evangelical American eyes, what I now see is simply heartbreaking. Government-secured human rights are mostly for privileged white people. Julia is not white. Julia is undocumented. Julia's first language is Spanish. Julia is a girl. These are all labels that set her back in a society made by and for white, passport-holding, English-speaking males. But God, who is neither white nor male, despite my use of the pronoun he, shines his good news on every human being alike. The book is Separated by the Border by Gina Thomas. Share the Thom Hartmann Program with your friends. We're available on SiriusXM, Free Speech TV, Pacifica, commercial stations nationwide, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, on the Thom Hartmann app, and you can even tell your smart speaker to listen to the Thom Hartmann Program. Welcome back. Just hang on just a second here. There we go. Playing with the magic numbers. Wanted to just talk briefly about President Biden and also solicit your thoughts. I mean, you know, what are your thoughts on President Biden visiting Ukraine? This is, and Jimmy Carter, President Jimmy Carter, and the state of the Republican Party. You know, David Frum talking about, well, you know, they're behaving like dicks, but, you know, maybe if they start talking about crime. I don't see it. I mean, what I'm seeing is the rise of an openly fascist party, an openly fascist political party. And I don't think I think one of the symptoms of an openly fascist political movement is behaving like a bully. But I respectfully, I think would go a whole lot farther, shall we say, than David Frum did. And, you know, and I get he's an ex-Republican, but all that. But curious your thoughts on that as well. This is where the GOP is at right now. You've got this headline, David Newert over at, I believe it's, or maybe it's Nywert, over at Daily Kos. He's a staff writer. The headline, right-wing pundits leap on Ohio disaster as proof Biden administration is, quote, waging a war on white people. This is from the Tucker Carlson show. He told his Fox audience of millions that the Environmental Protection Agency is, quote, not too concerned about the train derailment. Because it won't help them sell solar panels. Right. He said, and I quote, we can tell you the Biden administration doesn't seem too concerned about it either way. Donald Trump got over 71% of the vote in the county in the last presidential election. Carlson, of course, seems to have amnesia about the fact that it was Donald Trump who deregulated the railroads in 2017 that allowed this to happen. I mean, literally, that allowed this to happen. Also, Cy Hirsch's story about the U.S. blowing up the gas pipeline continues to unravel. It turns out that he is claiming now that he has only one single source for the story, and at least 3 of the points that he has made in that article have been demonstrably, proven not to be the case. And his source has claimed to have been in multiple places that are just basically simply impossible, like in the White House and in the Kremlin. It certainly sounds to me like a classic Russian disinformation campaign that Cy Hirsch got suckered into, which is really unfortunate, but, life goes on. All right, so picking up your calls and your thoughts. Oh, and Biden, like I said, is in Ukraine right now. Marjorie Taylor Greene trash-talking him for this, which is just very, very strange. Oh, and I was going to mention to you also, Richard Belzer died yesterday. Richard, I knew Richard. I didn't know him well, but we met a number of times and had a few meals together, and he introduced me at the Strand bookstore in New York City back, 15 years ago. We had dinner that night, and he got up and introduced my book. I think that was for Screwed, that book that he was introducing me for. But anyhow, he passed away at the age of 78, and his last words were you can't say it on the air. F you, mother effer, which was just like so in character in some ways with Richard Belzer. So Richard, rest in peace. A good guy and a great actor, just an absolutely brilliant actor. All right, let's pick up your phone calls here. Pearson in Lamarck, Texas. Hey, Pearson, what's on your mind today? Hey.
Hope you had a restful weekend. Listen, before I get you to clarify something you said with regards to that one-sentence definition of neoliberalism,
yeah,
I want to comment about Frum. Frum, isn't he, correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't he one of the people behind that No Labels scam several years back?
He's involved with it. I don't know what his level of involvement is these days, but yeah, I mean, he's a quote, moderate Republican. I think he's longing for a party that is dead now. I really do.
Yeah, and you know what they're going to do? They're going to start attacking and scavenging the bones of the Democratic Party unless we beat them to it, yeah, and populate the Democratic Party with unapologetic progressives like the Squad members. So we better step up our game before it's too late, because Republicans don't waste time. Yeah. Listen, about neoliberalism, I heard your definition, and there was an element that was missing, because I recall your definition many months ago, and correct me if I'm wrong, but unless that definition has changed, I would think that the key element that was missing in your definition today is that the liberalism part of the neoliberalism is that the free market is free to operate liberally. In other words, with little or no
regulation.
Regulation, yeah. So I thought
that was my point. The marketplace is above democracy. So the marketplace defines the terms of the game of democracy, rather than democracies defining the terms of the game of capitalism, of the marketplace. And,
right, they're allowed to operate liberally, which I thought was a good term to use, so people don't confuse that with liberals. Well, that's the part I have always trouble with.
Yeah, it's a problem. Because
other terms.
Yeah, these were European economists, and the word liberal in Europe means the exact opposite of what it means here in the United States. I mean, it means what we would call conservative. So.
Yeah, that's how they keep us coming and going. Listen, one other thing related to this, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but in my estimation, every Republican Party president we have had in the White House, let's say starting arbitrarily with Dwight D. Eisenhower, from Eisenhower on forward all the way up to and including Trump, each Republican Party president has been progressively worse. Not progressive, progressively worse. And starting with Eisenhower, for all that you can say that he did good, like the interstate highway system, some people would argue the way we did it was wrong, but he green-lighted Kermit Roosevelt going to, was it Iran, when they just elected Mossadegh? Yeah. Because the oil companies wanted.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, that was the era when the Dulles brothers and the CIA and whatnot were riding high, and there was this belief that we had conquered the Nazism, and next we were going to conquer communism, and expanding across the globe and building a larger national consensus for democracy, even if it meant overthrowing governments that we didn't like. Yeah, it was a very problematic period of time. I'm not an apologist for Eisenhower. I just want to point out to Republicans that he won 2 elections, 52 and 56, by huge margins, by saying that as a Republican, he supported expanding the right to unionize, he supported expanding social, and he did. He supported expanding Social Security, and he did. He supported building infrastructure across the United States, and he did.
And he did it with that progressive income tax code.
That's right, and he supported the 91% top income tax rate and the 52% top corporate income tax rate, and he maintained them throughout his presidency. So,
and we need to reestablish that without any loopholes. That's the key.
I'm with you.
No loopholes for the ultra wealthy, and Eisenhower's progressive tax code will be a solid foundation for this country, economic foundation on which we can build.
It would be. We need to repeal the Trump, Bush, and Reagan tax cuts, and if we did that, we would be back on a path toward a balanced budget. Which we can argue about whether that's even important, but it is costing us money to pay interest on the national debt. It's an interesting conundrum because Powell says he's trying to slow down the economy, but he raises interest rates, which means that the federal government has to pay a higher return on bonds. That higher return on bonds is more federal money, tax money being poured into the pockets of people who hold bonds, which are mostly the very, very rich, which is a stimulative thing in the economy that increases inflation. So it's like, one of those weird catch-22s. Pearson, I've got to move along, but thank you for the call. We covered a lot of territory there. David in Denver. Hey, David, what's on your mind today?
I had an idea that I wanted to bounce off you. And so the idea is that the federal government would give 0% loans to banks with the caveat that they could loan Americans at 2% anything that had to do with green energy. So, in other words, if you're buying either a new house or an old house that has solar panels on it, you can buy it at 2%. Right. Or if you're buying a car that's a hybrid, is that something that would work or no?
Well, it's not a terrible idea, but it's not anywhere near as kind of radical or progressive as what we just passed with the Inflation Reduction Act, where there's and the CHIPS Act. I mean, the CHIPS Act doesn't even have a cap on how much money corporations can in terms of support get for building chips factories here in the United States. The Inflation Reduction Act also could get a whole lot larger than when it was passed if enough Americans take advantage of it. Getting a 30% tax credit for solarizing your house, or changing the electrical infrastructure of your house. Thousands of dollars of subsidies for electric cars. I mean, that's direct money. That's not just the kind of indirect money that you're talking about there, David. So I really think that that's what we're doing. And our energy infrastructure is changing really rapidly. And in some of the most unusual places. I mean, almost 40% of the electricity in Texas now on some days is generated by wind and solar. Same thing in Iowa. Some of these states are really, really, stepping up to the plate. And it's the marketplace that's doing it, because wind and solar are now cheaper than any other form of energy. So, you've got all these new projects coming out that are building this. It's quite a remarkable thing. When I was flying into Michigan last week, as we were coming in over Lansing, there was this, you can see just north of Lansing, in the rural area, there was an area that looked like it stretched on for miles of just a massive wind farm. Must have been all kinds of, because there were all these farms, in the middle of it all. They must have all gotten together and, hooked up with a utility or something. So I think it's happening, David. I really do, and I think it's a really good thing. David, I got to run, but thank you for the call. We'll continue the conversation on the other side of the break, 45 minutes past the hour. In my opinion, Jimmy Carter was the best president of my lifetime. Now, somebody on Twitter said, what, were you born after John Kennedy? No, I think John Kennedy had the potential to be one of the great presidents, but his life was cut way too short. He was one of the most inspirational presidents. But in terms of what What could be done?
Listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
And who he was and the life he lived, I think Jimmy Carter was number one in my lifetime. What say you? We'll be right back. And welcome back. Bob in Desert Hot Springs, California. Hey, Bob, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom. Good morning. I have a question for you, Tom. I know money has always been in politics. There's no doubt about that. But when did lobbying start, Tom? You know, lobbying is really killing us with all their, their influence in the wrong places. What do you think about that?
Well, I would argue that lobbying, as in special interests making their case to politicians, began with the George Washington administration. The word lobbying goes back to the Abraham Lincoln administration. Lincoln, during the Civil War, was throwing massive amounts of money at building the railroads across the United States and building roads, building infrastructure that could be used to transport war material. And across the street from the White House is an old restaurant. It's still there. I think it's called the Churchill. I've been there once or twice, but it's right on what street would that be? I'm sorry, I don't recall the geography right around the White House there, but it's less than a block away from the White House, and that was a place where the special interests, the lobbyists, would hang out, and it was a hotel at the time as well as a restaurant. And so they would meet in the lobby of the hotel, and the president, Lincoln, would go over there, and apparently other politicians would go over, and that was the place to meet. That was where the wealthy and powerful met, and thus the word lobbying.
Oh, so that's where the word lobbying comes from, huh?
Yeah, literally. It came out of the Lincoln administration. Yeah. Interesting.
And Tom, I would just like to say one other statement. I think the problem today is we believe what we hear, not what we investigate.
Yeah. Well, if we don't investigate it, we're not going to hear it. But I think your point is well taken. Bob, thank you for the call. Robbie in Portland. Hey, Robbie, what's on your mind today? Sad thing about Cy Hirsch getting so wrong, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't know, Tom, because there was other stuff that was kind of proven and backed up. And the weird thing is you said you read it last week, but you read it and didn't realize that there was one source in it when you first read it. You brought it up like it was just. Well,
I saw that in the interview that Cy Hirsch did after it was published, where he was asked, how many sources did you have for this? And he said one.
Right.
I didn't catch that in the article. I mean, maybe I didn't read it carefully enough, Robbie. I'm sorry.
It kind of seems like that because not many people are really reading it. But I wanted to bring up there's a Swedish investigation and a German investigation that both said that there was absolutely no evidence Russia did it. So I'm just trying to figure out.
Well, they have no evidence anybody did it. That's the problem.
What's the disinformation? What's the disinformation?
Nobody's sure who did it. I'm not sure that this is disinformation. I think this is people trying to be honest about what they know, which is nobody knows anything.
How is it Seymour Hersh? How is it his misinformation? I'm confused. You said that it's like so wrong, but what's so wrong about it if they haven't proved it?
Well, he's making the claim that the federal government did something that the federal government is saying, no, we did not do. And he's making a claim that Putin would very much like the world to believe. And, there's just altogether too many people out there, too enthusiastic, like yourself, Robbie, to take Putin's side on these things and do carry Putin's water. I think it's really tragic. It's 10 minutes before the hour. We'll be back with more of your calls in just a moment on the other side of this. Stick around. Help support progressive radio. If you're listening to us on a commercial station, call their advertisers and let them know you're listening. If you're listening to us on Pacifica, one of our many nonprofit stations, please support them when they do their fundraising drives. Thanks for supporting Progressive Talk Radio and tag you're it. You know, James Baldwin was one of the greatest writers of the 20th century of any type, and his insights into black cops and police in general are just brilliant. This is one of his writings about black policemen. He said, "Black policemen were another matter. We used to say, if you must call a policeman, for God's sake, make sure it's a white one." And we hardly ever did call a policeman. A black policeman could completely demolish you. He knew far more about you than a white policeman could, and you were without defenses before this black brother in uniform, whose entire reason for breathing seemed to be his hope to offer proof that, though he was black, he was not black like you. Baldwin goes on to talk about, you know, black cops and his father and his relationship with his father and just the general violence perpetrated against black people. There's a whole video about it over at thomhartmann.com. You can check it out. And welcome back. Picking up your calls here. Mark in Schenectady, New York. Hey, Mark, what's up?
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up, you brought up about the dictatorial Republican Party and how far they're going to the right. And in Michigan, the Republican leadership has, and I can't think of the woman's name, she's going full board on denial, and she's not backing down, she's doubling down. And it's kind of sad, but we keep on waiting for the Republican Party to wake up. They are who they are.
Yeah,
they're not going to wake up.
Yeah.
They're not. They're going to go as far right as possible because, at least for the primaries, that works for them. So why would you change something that has worked? Now the general election is something different, but right now they're not interested in backing down, or they just want to double down.
Yeah.
And so, and I heard on one of the shows where they said we don't want a weak Republican Party. We need both a strong Republican Party and a strong Democrat Party and a true democracy. But that depends on whether the strong Republican Party is the old type of Republican Party and not what they currently have.
Whether there's a shared belief between the two parties that democracy is a system worth maintaining, basically.
Correct.
And the Republican Party
Correct.
has abandoned
Absolutely.
that belief. I think that's the main thing. They're also, I mean, you know, the Democratic Party is facing an interesting challenge right now because the Republicans are trying to brand the Democrats. You know, actually, rather than getting into all, I want to write an op-ed about this and really do a deep dive on it. So I'll just hold that thought in abeyance for the moment. But you know, this is it's a time of real challenge, I think, for both parties. Mark, thank you for the call. Mayor in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Hey, Mayor, what's on your mind today?
Hey there, Tom. Long-time listener, first-time caller. So happy to speak with you, and thank you so much for your years of service to our country in the form of real information. And I agree with you 100%. Jimmy Carter, also best president in my known history. What a man. What a man. And what I wanted to chat with you about today is, have you heard about this super PAC that is being constructed by one Republican donor with the backing of moderate Democrats and Republicans working together to thwart the efforts of any progressive trying to run for office moving forward?
What's the name of the super PAC?
That's a good question. I just got an email from Bernie about it, and he didn't really name a super PAC, and he also didn't name the Republican donor, so I need to dig into this, but I wondered if you had heard anything about it.
There are several super PACs that are aligned with more or less the kind of no labels movement and the problem solvers caucus, which is Democrats and Republicans. No labels and the problem solvers basically are all corporate shills. You know, they're you know, pimps for legislation that corporations want.
Yep.
And I mean, you know, that's kind of been with us always. And there's a lot of very wealthy people and giant corporations that are, you know, pouring money into those kind of things. But without knowing the name of that particular super PAC, I couldn't offer an opinion on it. But it doesn't surprise me. I mean, you know, we still have this cancer within the Democratic Party, And a number of these people are quite proud of themselves. I mean, Kurt Schrader here in Oregon, thank God we voted him out last time around, although, we ended up with a Republican. But I don't think that's going to hold for more than 2 years. But he was proud of the fact that he was, working to thwart any kind of legislation that would simply allow Medicare to negotiate drug prices. I mean, just as something as fundamental as that, should we all be ripped off by giant drug companies? I mean, there are drugs in the United States that, sell for $12 or $30 in Canada that are $1,000 or more here in the United States. Insulin here in the United States, $1,000, for a month's supply. In many cases, in most other countries, it's $25, $30. And they get away with it because they can. These are basically monopolies, and also with regard to Medicare, they get away with it because when George Bush rewrote the law in 2003 to roll out Medicare Advantage, they inserted this sweet little provision in there that forbade Medicare from negotiating for drug prices, which is insane. Medicare is the largest purchaser of drugs in the United States, and they have to pay full retail for every single pill as if they're buying them one at a time. It's nuts. Mayor, I got to run, but thank you. Thanks for bringing up some really important stuff. Thank you. It's great to hear from you, and congratulations on your first call. We'll be right back. It is, it's the top of the hour. On the other side of the hour, Ben Wickler is going to tell us about the most important race coming up this year. It's happening tomorrow.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
In addition to bringing you the Thom Hartmann Program here on Free Speech TV and Video Media Online, we also have a whole set of ways you can interact with us and tools you can use to spread the word about the importance of democracy and the threats to it in our republic. First, there's your daily homework. Sue Nethercutt puts together a daily email newsletter that has a link to every story I discuss on the air, so you can find my sources and you can share them with your friends. It's free and you can sign up at thomhartmann.com. Second, I publish my daily take every day over at the hartmannreport.com website. That's also free if you want the daily 5 days a week rant in your inbox. No ads either. Third, we have the podcasts. There's the free 1 hour version of our daily show that's advertising supported. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts normally. And then there's also the podcast of the entire 3 hour show with no advertisements, and that's available by subscription over at thomhartmann.com. So check them all out at thomhartmann.com and hartmannreport.com.
We say fight back!
On Earth, the deepest part of our oceans is a massive canyon in the West Pacific called the Mariana Trench. More than 35,000 feet deep, the pressure of the water is 1,000 times that of the surface of the ocean. At that depth, a normal submarine would collapse like a paper bag. There's very little life there, and what does live is adapted to cold, pressure, and darkness like nowhere else on Earth. The first man to dive solo to the bottom of the Mariana Trench was filmmaker James Cameron. A lay expert on the oceans, in part from his work making the movie Titanic, Cameron designed, funded, 2012, navigated his own submarine, the Deep Sea Challenger, into these icy depths. To say that James Cameron understands the ocean in a way that few other human beings ever could would be an understatement. From shallow dives to the deepest place on Earth, he knows the seas, and he knows about their methane clathrate rates. As he told me earlier this year, quote, "The bottom line is that given the number of species expected to die off in the next century just due to climate change and the other effects of our industrial civilization, we are already in the middle of a mass extinction event equivalent to the Leo history, such as the KT extinction that took out the dinosaurs. So the Homo sapien isn't a species that's currently endangered. However, the clathrate gun scenario, James Cameron said, changes that. It doubles down on an already bad situation, putting us on the hit list as well. Not literally, because some people probably will survive in highly artificial environments, meaning the species will perish, but the vast majority of will perish." Cameron added, with a metaphor worthy of his brilliant Avatar movies, "We're talking about the survival of our kids. We collectively are playing Russian roulette. We're putting a gun to their heads and going click, 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 a clathrate gun." only discovered in the serious way in the 1960s. There is so much methane in the form of clathrates, such as the frozen methane slurry on the floor of the continental shelves around the oceans of the world, that it's at least double all the known underground coal, oil, and gas on the entire planet. Peter Ward, the paleontologist at the University of Bristol, told me, quote, methane is way worse than carbon dioxide. It's inert right now in the soil. It's not affecting anyone in any way. When you warm it, though, it becomes a gas, and then it starts acting immediately as a greenhouse gas. So this is an immediate and very short-term threat to human civilization. For the last decade, a joint U.S.-Russia research team out of the International Arctic Research Center at the University of Alaska, Fairbanks, has been exploring the East Siberian Sea. Arctic. They are looking at the bottom of the seafloor where once stable reserves of frozen methane have begun thawing and bubbling up into the atmosphere. Dr. Igor Semeletov told the research team in 2011. He told the British newspaper, The Independent, about what he found that year and the scope of the impending methane problem. Quote, earlier we found torch-like structures like this, but they were only tens of meters in diameter. This is the first time that we found continuous, powerful, and impressive seeping structures more than 1,000 meters in diameter. It's amazing, end of quote. Amazing academically, that is. Horrifying for those of us who call planet Earth home. 1,000 meters is a kilometer, so this is one massive single methane leak, and it's a bit more than a half mile in diameter. And it is just one of many. Dr. Semeletov added, quote, I was most impressed by the sheer scale and high density of the plumes. Over a relatively small area, we found more than 100, but over a wider area, there should be thousands of them, end quote. Those sites would have been familiar during the Permian and other extinctions as well. As Paul Wignall explained to me, the significant thing about a methane is it's a very effective greenhouse gas, so it causes global warming. Once you trigger warming, if you release methane, it's in positive feedback. It gets warmer and warmer as you release more methane into the atmosphere. So we think of this as a big part of the Permian extinction at that time. This is very rapid warming. Charles Dickens, who had proposed the methane link to the Permian mass extinction, told me, we know that in the bottom of the seafloor, large parts of the ocean margins have methane in a solid phase. And what happens when you change the temperature, it can melt this frozen methane phase. He added, the idea is that during some of these extinction events, we have some triggering that forces the ocean temperatures to warm, and then that melts the solid methane phase, which turns into gas and goes into the oceans and atmosphere. Paleontologist Michael Benton concluded, quote, the risk is runaway greenhouse, which is when the self-correcting mechanisms cease to kick in, and you heat by a little bit and you release methane. That then causes excess heating and you release more methane, and so it goes on. It's believed at the end of the Permian, 250 million years ago, this kind of runaway greenhouse gas exacerbated the effect, making it, the Permian mass extinction, an awful lot worse. By 2010, it was said that 8 million tons of methane emissions were being released into the atmosphere every year. But researchers believe that, too, is an underestimate. More recent studies have shown a far more rapid increase in methane, CH4 concentration in the atmospheres. In the last 2 centuries, the amount of methane in the atmosphere has increased from 0.7 ppm to 1.7 ppm. That's the largest known increase in the history of the planet. The book, The Last Hours of Humanity.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back to the second hour of our program. On the line with us is the chair of the Wisconsin Democratic Party, wisdems.org, WISDEMS.org is the website. Ben Wickler, and Ben, BENWIKLER on Twitter, and Wisdems on Twitter. Ben, welcome back to the program. You know, I have known you for, I think, a decade or longer, and have always been impressed by you and your political acumen, and have been watching your career now as chair of the Wisconsin Democratic Party, and I'm just so impressed by the work you're doing. I just wanted to tip my hat to you before we even began the conversation. Tell us about this Wisconsin Supreme Court race tomorrow and why people all across the country should be concerned about this.
Absolutely, and that's very kind of you to say, Tom. I appreciate it. I am joining you now from Wisconsin, the only state in the country where 4 of the last 6 presidential races has come down to less than 1 percentage point. And what happens tomorrow is that Wisconsin voters will choose the 2 general election nominees for a state Supreme Court race to determine who will fill the tip the balance open seat on our state Supreme Court. Whoever wins that race, the general elections April 4th, will cast the deciding vote in every critical judicial decision that shapes voting rights, that shapes abortion freedoms, that shapes whether the 2024 election result will be certified properly or not. All of those decisions hang on what happens 6 weeks and 1 day from now. And all of that is connected to what happens tomorrow. Wisconsin is the state that has to be won by whoever wants to get to the White House. It is the state that put Trump over the top in 2016. It's the state that put Biden over the top in 2020. It is in both parties' crosshairs in 2024. And tomorrow we will narrow from a 4-candidate field in the primary to 1 progressive and 1 conservative, hyper-conservative, mega-conservative. We know that both of the Republicans running in this race will do just about anything to cement Republican power in defiance of democracy. And so really, this is the starting gun for the most important election of 2023, and it's all hands on deck.
Yeah, tomorrow is the primary, and then the general is in April. I'm sorry, I had thought that this was the general election. That's why I wanted to get you on. I'm a little out of touch with, individual state races, but the Ohio Supreme Court has involved itself in some very, very consequential decisions, some of which have national import. Can you tell us about what might be the stakes for Wisconsin and how, as precedent, that may echo nationally?
Absolutely. I mean, it's most people, even in Wisconsin, aren't aware of the election dates, of what's going on, the stakes in this race. I call this the most important election nobody's ever heard of, right? Because turnout plummets in these spring elections. They're nonpartisan officially. There's no D or R next to the candidates' names. And yet the consequences for everything political and really everything in life are hard to overstate. Let's start with abortion. Wisconsin has a law that was passed in the year 1849, before women could vote, before the invention of modern medicine, that makes performing an abortion a felony punishable by 6 years in prison. And it's not clear whether that law is enforceable today. And until it's clear, no hospital in Wisconsin, no clinic is providing abortion care, even when it's care for a miscarriage that could not possibly lead to a pregnancy, because this incredibly antiquated law might be in effect and people might be prosecuted. The state Supreme Court will decide whether this abortion ban should be enforceable or whether it has been invalidated by subsequent laws that passed. So this election will determine the future of reproductive freedom in the state of Wisconsin. That's, for starters, maybe the most personal issue, the issue that will motivate the most voters in the race this April. It will echo for years to come. But for the rest of the country, the bigger spotlight might be on the stakes for democracy. Our state Supreme Court ruled last year that to deliver a relative's absentee ballot, or to use that should be a crime, that to use a drop box should be illegal. All the drop boxes were removed for absentee ballots in our state, not because our legislature passed a law that our governor signed. Our governor would have vetoed a law like that, but because the state Supreme Court decided to make up these new rules out of whole cloth after decades in which drop boxes were used to deliver absentee ballots. Our state Supreme Court looked at the redistricting situation. The right-wing legislature had proposed ultra gerrymandered maps. Our Democratic governor vetoed the Republicans' proposal, proposed fair maps. The state Supreme Court just chose the most gerrymandered maps in the country. We're a 50-50 state. 6 out of 8 congressional seats are held by Republicans. And almost 2/3, a near supermajority of our state legislative seats are held by Republicans because the maps are rigged. What this means is that once we have a new Supreme Court, if a progressive wins, they could declare these unconstitutional district lines unconstitutional. This happened in Pennsylvania before. We could have new maps drawn in the state of Wisconsin. That could mean, even if it's just a 50-50 year, like so many years are in Wisconsin, 2 more House seats for Democrats in the U.S. Congress. It could mean a shot for Democrats to actually win majorities in the state legislature. Cases around union organizing. Our current state, the partisan Republican majority in our state Supreme Court upheld our former Governor Scott Walker's attacks on unions, Act 10, which hammered public sector unions, then right to work laws. Those could be vulnerable to constitutional challenge in our state. We could restore the right to work. And if not now, then once we win majorities in the state legislature, we could do it legislatively. So much progress is possible. But if we don't win, we are stuck in a doom loop where Republicans choose their own district lines to guarantee their reelection. And then the state Supreme Court rubber stamps those maps so that no matter how infuriated the public becomes about Republican corruption, Republican perfidy, Republican attacks on the idea of democracy, there's no recourse for voters because the district lines are drawn in a way that guarantees that Republicans will have a hammerlock on our state legislature, the state budget, and the state lawmaking process.
Yeah.
Those are the stakes.
Yeah, you mean restore the right to unionize, right? Rather
Absolutely.
Than the right to work
That's
for
what,
less.
That's what could happen.
And boy, it's been a while since I've heard anybody use the word perfidy. Good on you, Ben. Who are the behind-the-scenes players here? I'm guessing that the progressive nominee will probably have a lot of support. You're not sure who that's going to be right now?
Well, there's 2. There's Janet Protasewicz and Everett Mitchell. Either of them would be a night and day, a day and night improvement over what we see from the Republicans right now. Right. Our state party, our constitution, we're neutral between those 2 primary candidates, and we're encouraging folks to go out and vote for either one.
Okay.
But I can tell you who's behind the Republican side in this field.
Great, go for it.
It's a kind of scary roster. So there are 3 names I want to highlight in particular. The first one is Richard Uihlein. Richard and his wife Liz Uihlein are the biggest Republican donors in the country. They were the biggest funders of the Stop the Steal rally right before the January 6th insurrection. And they, through a super PAC, have declared that they're going to spend millions of dollars, particularly to put Dan Kelly, one of the 2 Republican candidates in this race, on the Supreme Court. They've already spent $1.5 million, but that's just a down payment. The second one is Diane Hendricks. Diane Hendricks is the wealthiest self-made woman in the country. She runs ABC Home. She's an ultra MAGA Republican donor. She has also just started pouring money into the race. Diane Hendricks and Richard Uihlein put $29 million into the race to reelect Ron Johnson. They're the reason why Ron Johnson won by 1 percentage point in 2022, even though he was so profoundly unpopular through a smear campaign orchestrated by the guy who did Swift Boat Veterans for Truth and now is running Donald Trump's campaign. That was all funded by those 2 billionaires. And the third name, even scarier than the other 2, is Leonard Leo, the architect of the Federalist Society's strategy to basically rig the whole court system, starting with the Supreme Court on down. He personally donated $20,000 just in the last week to Dan Kelly, one of these Republican candidates. It's pretty clear that the whole Federalist Society donor network, Leonard Leo controls more than $1 billion that was handed to him by a Republican mega donor, and the Uihlein and Hendricks special interest money will come crashing in. So this is going to be a contest of democracy and people power and the rule of law and all the things that we're supposed to stand for in this country against the money power, against an attempt to rig our judicial system to lock in small d democratic power in the state that tips national power.
We're talking
That's what's at stake here, and we see the other side coming right at us.
I get it. We're talking with Ben Wickler, the chair of the Wisconsin Democratic Party. wisdems.org is the website. Ben, last question here. We're running out of time. What can people who are not in Wisconsin, obviously if you're in Wisconsin, make sure that your voter registration is up to date and show up both for the primary and for the general election in April. But what can people who are outside Wisconsin do to help?
We need your time, your treasure, and your talent. Go to wisdems.org/phone bank, and you can sign up for our volunteer phone banks. They happen pretty much every day. We need calls in to make sure that people who share our values turn out and vote in this election. They're grateful for your calls. You're not annoying people right now. Most people don't know this race is happening. wisdems.org/volunteer and wisdems.org/donate. We're allowed to provide unlimited support to our candidate in the general election through the party. So we'll be running a massive get out the vote program, voter protection program, communications operation. please do chip in. Your dollars can go further in this race than just about any other political context, because this race tips the court, that tips the state, that tips the country.
You said that the race is nonpartisan, and yet there's a primary, and you're expecting basically a Republican and a Democrat to come out of this. How does that work?
So essentially, the work of the party, the work of also the Republicans working on this race, the work of the candidates has been to communicate with voters about their values. So at this point, we can tell from our polling, but progressive voters are going to vote for either the two progressive candidates. Conservatives will vote for either the two conservative candidates. It's like two sides of a piece of pizza. Mm-hmm. And as long as one or the other or both of the sides isn't completely perfect, it has at least some margin between the winner and the loser, you wind up with one progressive and one conservative, just running through the math. So we're confident it'll be one from each lane. But then in the general election, it becomes this arm wrestling match in a state that is almost perfectly balanced on a knife's edge to figure out who wins. There were two elections that came down to less than half a percentage point for state Supreme Court over the last 12 years. This could be that close, one vote per precinct. So this is a moment when every dollar and every phone call could actually win the election.
So get thee over to wisdems, WISDEMS.org, and /volunteer/donate/ whatever. And or just check it from the main menu, I'm assuming, Ben. Ben Wickler, the chair of the Wisconsin Democratic Party. Keep up the great work, Ben. Great having you with us. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tom.
Yeah, great talking with you. We will be back. Why is the Republican Party trying to drive America deeper into poverty? I'll tell you about that right after the break.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And has Marjorie Taylor Greene become a useful troll for Keven McCarthy, or is she going off in another new weird direction? Or both? And welcome back. Michael in North Las Vegas, Nevada. Hey, Michael, what's on your mind today?
Yes, hey, Tom. Good to talk with you. We haven't talked since their America days. I just wanted to mention that Jimmy Carter was also my governor, and when he was on his way to D.C., they let us out of class so that we could see his train going up to D.C.
Michael, I'm sorry, your phone is breaking up so badly, I can't quite figure out what you're saying. I'm going to put you on hold here, and you and Joyce can work it out. Joyce, he's on line too. Morty in Los Angeles. Hey, Morty, thanks for listening to KPFK. What's up?
Hey, Tom, how are you, man?
I'm good. What's on your mind?
Good. I just want to tell you, I am a long-time listener, first-time caller, and I love listening to your show. I've supported you, and I would say I agree with you on almost 95% of your views. And one thing I've always loved about your show is I always learn from you. And one thing I've learned is a healthy skepticism for U.S. foreign policy, for the military-industrial complex, for the CIA. And I've just been kind of troubled by the fact that the skepticism that you seem to have had for years on those with those institutions has flown out the window when it comes to the war in Ukraine. And I just wanted to talk to you about that.
Marty, the war in Ukraine, in my opinion, is a clear, you've got a dictatorial mass murderer who has attacked a democracy. And you basically have to choose. Are you going to stand with a democracy against a dictatorial mass murderer, or are you going to stand with a mass murderer?
Well, I think you're kind of oversimplifying.
I am not oversimplifying it. There is no middle ground here. Either Russia destroys Ukraine or they don't. Ukraine didn't start this war.
We're not talking about. I'm talking about what should Americans do, and should we use our brains to look at what's going on and not just be forced to accept the party line coming from the CIA.
There's no party line, and it's not coming from the CIA, Morty. This is obvious. You can just look out your window. You could look at the damn news. Russia is. They're using rape officially as a weapon of war. They're using rape of children as a weapon of war. They have murdered thousands, tens of thousands of civilians. They're bombing cities back to the Stone Age. Morty, there is absolutely no justification. I'm sorry, I put him on hold because, it's because he's trying to talk over me, but I'll put him back on and you can just ride the pot, Sean. But Morty, you've got a murderous regime here that is committing war crimes right in front of the whole world, and I don't understand why you would want to defend that.
Am I able to talk now?
I am listening. Why would you defend a murderous?
I'm not defending that.
You absolutely are.
It's true. I am not. What I want to know is, why do you accept everything that is coming out?
You have no idea what I accept or don't accept, but I'm telling you, this war, this is black and white, Morty. Yeah, okay. I'm sorry, Morty. This is not Fox News. We'll be right back. It's 22 minutes past the hour. Stick around. Missed my opening rant today? It's usually published over at HartmannReport.com, where you can read it and share it with your friends for free. Check it out, HartmannReport.com. Just some amazing stuff going on over on Fox News. Megan Lapp and David Stevenson have been regular guests across Fox News, and they're claiming to be all worried about whales, all these whales that are dying off the east coast of the United States, arguing that these are the result of the windmills that are out there, right? The ocean wind and the work done to install them. Well, it turns out that Lapp works for an organization whose largest donor is Charles Koch. Whose largest donor is the Texas Public Policy Foundation that gets their money from Charles Koch. And Stevenson works for a group whose largest donor, the Caesar Rodney Institute, is the American Fuel and Petrochemical Manufacturers. So if you have friends who are watching Fox News and they're concerned about the whales, you might want to let them know what's going on. There's a whole video about it over at ThomHartmann.com. Check it out. And welcome back. It is 23 minutes past the hour, and let's see here. All right, the American plan, or the GOP plan, this is pretty breathtaking, really, when you think about it. The Republican Party right now is, Jake Johnson writing about this over at commondreams.org. The GOP is taking budget advice from Trump official who wants to cut $2 trillion from Medicaid. And yeah, this is the former Office of Management and Budget Chief, Russ Voss, guy who worked for Trump, has emerged as, this is a quote from the Washington Post, has emerged as one of the central voices shaping the looming showdown over federal spending and the national debt. And they just put out a 104-page memo dealing with specific spending levels for every federal agency, and basically they want to obliterate Social Security and Medicare. Vaught's agenda, the Post noted, proposes $9 trillion in federal spending cuts over the next 10 years, targeting thousands of domestic programs, including Medicaid and SNAP, a Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, sometimes referred to as food stamps. So, the Republicans, once again, they're all about tax cuts for billionaires. They're all about deregulation of giant corporations and tax cuts for giant corporations, not so much for average working people. In the meantime, we've got Marjorie Taylor Greene. Speaking of the Republican Party, on Friday, she tweeted that there was this, she said, too many people in the Republican Party have fallen prey to liars and grifters. Quote, she said, there are grifters and liars that our base believe, unfortunately. These people always claim to, quote, know the truth and have, quote, sources, but always mislead people and grift for donations. Can't wait for the real news tomorrow. I love being right. And a lot of people are going, what? What's she talking about? What? And, well, today she's tweeting, everyone I talk to says this. We need a national divorce from the sick and disgusting woke culture issues shoved down our throats to the Democrats' traitorous America last policies. We are done. She goes on to say Americans hate Joe Biden because of his visit to Ukraine, among other things. This is the face of the Republican Party. Now, my take on it, when Marjorie Taylor Greene first came out and said, you know, there's grifters and liars among us, among the Republicans, was that she's watching what happened with Lauren Boebert. Lauren Boebert almost lost her race. Lauren Boebert has embraced crazy. And Marjorie Taylor Greene has decided, I believe, that going down the crazy road is not going to, it might help her in the primaries, but she doesn't have to worry about primaries anymore. She's in her second term in Congress, or not worry so much. So I think that she's starting to suck up to the power structure, as it were, and that's Keven McCarthy and friends. So the question is, how far is she going to go in taking on her own party? And I think she put a toe in the water last week and might be pulling that toe out today, because she's now back to promoting the Russian line. You know, we now have around 40 members of 40 Republicans in Congress who are openly supporting and parroting Vladimir Putin's propaganda about Ukraine.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Be right back with your calls and thoughts on all these things right after this. Hartmann Book Club is Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence by Anna Lemke, MD. This is from the introduction. This book is about pleasure. It's also about pain. Most important, it's about the relationship between pleasure and pain and how understanding that relationship has become essential to a life well lived. Why? Because we transformed the world from a place of scarcity to a place of overwhelming abundance. Drugs, food, news, gambling, shopping, gaming, texting, sexting, Facebooking, Instagramming, YouTubing, tweeting. The increased numbers, variety, and potency of highly rewarding stimuli is absolutely staggering. The smartphone is the modern-day hypodermic needle, delivering digital dopamine 24/7 to a wired generation. If you haven't met your drug of choice yet, it's coming soon to a website near you. Scientists rely on dopamine as a kind of universal currency for measuring the addictive potential of any experience. The more dopamine in the brain's reward pathway, the more addictive the experience. In addition to the discovery of dopamine, one of the most remarkable neuroscientific findings in the past century is that the brain processes pain and pleasure in the same place. Further, pleasure and pain work like the opposite sides of a balance. We've all experienced that moment of craving a second piece of chocolate or wanting a good book, movie, or video game to last forever. That moment of wanting is the brain's pleasure balance tipped to the side of pain. This book aims to unpack the neuroscience of reward and, in doing so, enable us to find a better, healthier balance between pleasure and pain. But neuroscience isn't enough. We also need the lived experience of human beings. Who better to teach us how to overcome compulsive overconsumption than those most vulnerable to it, people with addictions? This book is based on true stories of my patients falling prey to addiction and finding their way out again. They've given me permission to tell their stories so that you might benefit from their wisdom, as I have. You may find some of these stories shocking, but to me they're just extreme versions of what we're all capable of. As philosopher and theologian Kent Dunnington wrote, quote, "Persons with severe addictions are among those contemporary prophets that we ignore to our own demise, for they show us who we truly are," end quote. Whether it's sugar or shopping, voyeuring or vaping, social media posts or the Washington Post, we all engage in behaviors we wish we didn't, to an extent we regret. This book offers practical solutions for how to manage compulsive overconsumption in a world where consumption has become the all-encompassing motive of our lives. In essence, the secret to finding balance is combining the science of desire with the wisdom of recovery. And then we jump to the conclusion chapter. We all desire a respite from the world, a break from the impossible standards we often set for ourselves and others. It's natural that we would want to seek a reprieve from our own relentless ruminations. Why did I do that? Why can't I do this? Look at what they did to me. How could I have done that to them? So we're drawn to any of the pleasurable forms of escape that are now available to us. Trendy cocktails, the echo chamber of social media, binge watching reality shows, an evening of internet porn, potato chips and fast food, immersive video games, second-rate vampire novels. The list really is endless. Addictive drugs and behaviors provide that respite, but add to our problems in the long run. What if, instead of seeking oblivion by escaping from the world, we turn toward it? What if, instead of leaving the world behind, we immerse ourselves in it? Mohammed, you'll remember, was my patient who tried various forms of self-binding to limit his cannabis consumption, only to find himself right back where he started, progressing from moderation to excessive consumption to addiction at an ever faster cadence. He went hiking at Point Reyes, a nature trail just north of San Francisco, in hopes of finding refuge in an activity that had previously given him pleasure, as he once again tried to get control of his cannabis consumption. But every turn in the bend brought fresh memories of smoking weed. Hiking trips in the past had almost always occurred in a state of semi-intoxication. And so instead of being an escape, the hike turned into an agony of craving and a painful reminder of loss. He despaired of ever being able to wrestle his cannabis problem into submission. Then he had his aha moment. At one particular vista point where he had explicit memories of smoking a joint with friends, he brought the camera up to his eye and pointed it to a nearby plant. He saw a bug on a leaf and focused the camera further, zooming in on the beetle's bright red carapace, striated antennae, and ferociously hairy legs. He was mesmerized. His attention was snared by the creature in his crosshairs. He took a series of pictures, then changed his angle and took more. For the rest of the hiking trip, he stopped to take extremely close-up pictures of beetles. As soon as he did so, his cravings for cannabis decreased. I had to force myself to be very still, he told me at one of our sessions in 2017. I had to achieve a perfect stillness to take a good in-focus picture. That process grounded me, literally, and centered me. I discovered a strange, surreal, and compelling world at the end of my camera that rivaled the world I escaped to with drugs. But this was better because no drugs were needed. Many months later, I realized Mohammed's path to recovery was similar to my own. The book is called Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. It's written by Anna Lembke, MD. Dopamine Nation by Anna Lembke. Share the Thom Hartmann Program with your friends. Our podcast, The Hartmann Report, is absolutely free and available wherever fine podcasts are available. And the entire 3-hour podcast is available over at thomhartmann.com. And welcome back. By the way, if you were on hold a minute ago, all our lines were filled, but we were hearing this crackling on the phone, and I thought it might be on our end, so we rebooted our phones, which dumped all of our callers. So it wasn't personal. Just, call back, as they say in the radio business. So picking up your calls and your thoughts on the day. Nicholas in San Cristobal, in Mexico. Hey, Nicholas, what's up?
First of all, just hoping you're okay now and everything's calming down for you and your family.
I'm fine.
Yeah, good. Bless you. Bless all of you. An important article, I think, really an important article in today's New York Times that you might have read. It was entitled pretty strongly, "The trouble with Russia is Russia," and it's written by the great Ukrainian novelist Oksana Zabushko, who has always written brilliantly. And this article is so brilliantly written. I want to bring something up with you that she brought quickly, because I know time's always of the essence here. But she goes into the Chechnya, the history of Chechnya, particularly after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Chechnya was one of the two autonomous republics, I guess they were called, of the newly independent Russian Federation. Right. They claimed independence, and the Russians weren't having it. Right. The problem was the West was doing nothing about it. Right. They left the Chechens to fight the Russians.
Putin went in there and he flattened them. I mean, he killed thousands.
Bloodbath. Yeah. The West should be ashamed forever for not having. this was what began the whole Russian incursion into Ukraine, she claims, and brilliantly so.
Well, it went from Chechnya to Georgia to the covert activity in Moldova, which is now bearing fruit this week.
Now blossoming, if you will, in a bad way, bearing what do they call it, the dark fruit of history.
Yeah.
She goes on to say that the dismemberment, basically, of the Soviet Empire was duly halted at the borders of Russia itself, right? At the cost of these devastating wars that you just mentioned, Chechnya being the biggest of them, which she refers to as Ishkaria as part of Ukraine. Here we go. So she says, basically, if I have to find this, she says it so beautifully. She says that basically it has brought about the whole new state of being for Russia that allows for imperialist terrorist war. And that she goes into the long history of Russia so brilliant. You've got to read this article. That Russia basically has always been an imperialist nation from its very incept.
Sure.
It has been, whether it calls itself Soviet, whether it calls itself the Russian Federation, or whether it calls itself Tsarist Russia.
Yeah, it's always been about empire. Where is this article published, Nicholas?
What? Sorry?
Where?
Oh, sorry. It's the New York Times today, and it's brilliant. The problem with Russia is Russia.
Okay, I'll check it out.
And it's Oksana Bashkova, and she's brilliant. This lady writes, number one, as only a great novelist can, but she writes this long, incredible history, step by step by step, about what Russia actually has always been and is now and will probably always continue to be, and as she claims, until it is completely dismembered and starts from scratch.
Yeah.
It's quite incredible.
Dismember, well.
And it underlines everything you've been saying all along way, and everybody, I think, who's half-decently informed about the entire situation. Russia is simply the aggressor and must be stopped.
Yeah. Yeah, this is, I mean, it begs the question, if the West had gone to the defense of Austria, or Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, or even Poland in 1939, might we have succeeded in stopping, in keeping the Nazis in a bottle, and then, their own corruption would have imploded.
Have all been avoided.
Yeah.
But we're certainly not going to avoid future problems if we don't stop Putin now.
I agree.
Authoritarian terrorist war simply is not on. It can't be allowed.
I'm with you. Nicholas, thank you. Thank you. Very well said. I'll check out the New York Times today. Greg in Sherman Oaks, California. Hey, Greg, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom. We've met when Stephanie Miller interviewed you out here at UCLA.
Uh-huh.
And I have been a longtime fan and a supporter.
Well, thank you.
I just wanted to bring up an issue that I'd love to get your attention to in regard to enforcement of civil rights complaints in California.
Okay.
And here's an interesting statistic. Less than 1% of 2016 complaints resulted in litigation. Of the 4,799 claims the DFEH investigated, it referred only 118, which is 2%, to the legal division, which then brought only 26% of that to litigation.
Mm-hmm.
And so, for example...
well, hang on just a second. I mean, there's an alternative in here someplace. Is that because other cases were settled out of court essentially with apologies or fines or changes in behavior or people getting fired?
Well, interestingly, probably 95 to 98% of the cases are dismissed and statused as insufficient evidence because the agency uses an electronic filtering system like employers use with resumes. And if you don't check enough boxes, or if you don't check the right boxes, they just turn around and hand it back to you with a letter giving you a right to sue, assuming that you have a small fortune to put into litigation. And then they file, a minuscule number of cases.
Yeah.
And
so what are you going to do about this, Greg?
I've been trying to
get every investigative journalist outlet interested in this. I got my former assemblyman, Adrian Nazarian, to follow up with it, and they stiff-armed him, and the agency refuses any disclosure about their internal investigations, and they refuse public records requests. Huh. And I had a case that was in there, so I know exactly how that
Well, you might want to reach out to James over at randomlengthnews.com, I think is the website. You know, he publishes a community newspaper there and does some pretty amazing stuff. There's also the LA Progressive. I mean, you've got a couple of good progressive publications in Southern California there. I realize it's not Sherman Oaks. Actually, I'm not sure where Sherman Oaks is now that I think about it. Are you in the LA area?
It's just over the hill from.
Okay, so you've got a couple of good publications there, and of course you got people who work at KPFK. Jump on it and keep me up to date on what happens there. Greg, thanks for the call. Dan in Seal Beach, California. Hey, Dan, what's on your mind today?
Is that Ben?
Yeah, Dan.
Hello?
You're on the air.
No, it's Ben.
Oh, Ben. Okay, we got written down wrong. I'll fix that. B-E-N, right?
Tom.
Yes, sir.
Why are we not taking this war in Ukraine in context? I believe the whole genesis of this thing was started in 2014 when we overthrew the government in the Ukraine.
When we overthrew the government.
A puppet dictatorship.
Wait a minute, you're talking about the Yanukovych government that Paul Manafort went in and helped put into place with money from Vladimir Putin? When that government was overthrown in the Orange Revolution by the Ukrainian people? Is that what you're talking?
Yes.
Ben, are you seriously calling up here to try to feed more Russian propaganda into this program? Honest to God?
You call it Russian propaganda.
Yeah, it is. It absolutely is.
Did we not help overthrow that government?
I don't know, but I think it was. I don't think that having the government being run by Paul Manafort and Vladimir Putin was doing Ukraine any good. Ben, good try. Another tanky there. Oh my God, Rick in Seattle. Hey, Rick, what's on your mind?
Oh, hey, Tom, how are you?
I'm well. What's up?
Well, what I was interested in talking about is that the Republican Party just is so out of touch with the whole idea of democracy these days, and I feel that they're going to, they have to evolve with the rest of the world, or they'll end up, making themselves insignificant. And what I really think there should be is a one world government that, with nation states that keep their sovereignty, but have an underlying democratic socialist point of view.
It's called the United Nations
for the whole world. Yeah, well, it should be a United Nations, really, instead of just a building that's called that.
Well, I think they're doing the best they can, given that more than half the governments in the world are autocratic rather than democratic.
I know we need to change that somehow with the votes of the people around the world.
Well, I think what's happening right now seems to be that the world is becoming a kind of a bipolar, axis. Allies and Axis kind of thing, like it was, with World War II, which is concerning, particularly with China, getting closer and closer to Russia, and now, the Biden administration, warning them about arming, giving Russia lethal aid in Ukraine. Rick, thank you for the call. I'm still just amazed at the tanky who called a few minutes ago and said that, when the Russians intervened in democratic Ukraine with Paul Manafort and installed a Russian puppet, Yanukovych, that overthrowing him, the people of Ukraine overthrowing him, was somehow a bad thing.
To Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archive.
And of course, Paul Manafort came to the United States with money from another Russian oligarch who's close to Putin and helped install Donald Trump. And where are these tankies getting this crap? Welcome back. Jeff in Fort Dodge, Iowa. Hey, Jeff, what's on your mind today?
Yeah, Tom, I'd like to talk about this train derailment in Ohio. I worked for the railroad in the track department for 39 years. And I don't know what Donald Trump, of course, is not my favorite person at all. And I don't know what regulations that he removed.
I can tell you.
But I do know that most train derailments occur because either of human failure or mechanical or track failure.
Yeah.
And we've had, for the years that I've worked, and I've been to many derailments, the rails break underneath a train because of the cold, bitter weather. I know that wheels and axles will break on cars. I know that train handling has a lot to do with a lot of derailments and the speed of the train. One thing that I am concerned about is the railroad industry has been putting multiple trains together, and they have been running trains instead of where you used to have 100 and 150 cars. Now you might have 300 or 350 cars. You might have 3 engines in the front, 3 engines in the middle, and 3 engines pushing in the back. And I don't know much about this train. It sounds kind of like a normal freight train.
It was 150 cars.
Okay, it's not a monster train then, total. And there's thousands of them that run across our country, freight trains similar to that every day. So there's some questions about, I don't know what Trump, like I say, removed, but I do know... He
removed the requirement that the railroads put in the new electronic braking systems that reduce braking distance by 60%.
But that probably wouldn't have had a whole lot to do if something broke underneath the train or an axle.
Well, it would have reduced the number of cars involved in the disaster because the train wouldn't have moved as far.
Well, I don't know how great those stop, but I do know a 50-car train moving at about 50 miles takes over a mile and a quarter to stop.
Right, and with the new electronic brakes, it would take 0.6 of a mile, or it would take 0.4 of a mile.
Okay, but a lot of these cars and stuff, who's going to implement this? Because a lot of cars on railroad system, no, because a lot of the cars that are moved on the railroad are private cars. You're going to have, it's not every car on the railroad is owned by the railroad. You have, a lot of these corporations and stuff have their own cars.
Right,
so
and they were going to have to upgrade to these kind of brakes, and that's why in 2017, this was a rule that was put into place 4 or 5 years earlier during the Obama administration, and the railroads didn't like it because it was going to cost them a whole pile of money. And by the way, this particular line and this particular train had derailed in more or less the same place about a year ago. So Trump said, no, you don't have to do that. We're gonna set that rule aside. He canceled the rule. And there are multiple people, multiple safety specialists who have come out and said if that rule was in place, this would have been a minor derailment rather than a major disaster.
Well, that's fine if that's the case, but like I say, railroads run on FRA standards. And FRA inspectors goes over those tracks just as a railroad inspector does. And the railroad FRA comes around every month or so, and they inspect that track, and that track has to meet certain standards. So,
yeah. No, I get it. Jeff, I got to run. Thank you for the call. It's 10 minutes before the hour. Hey, thanks so much for sharing our program and for reaching out to our stations and sponsors and letting them know that you're listening. It really means a lot to us. One of the things that has always baffled me is why after the Mueller report found, after the Mueller investigation found that there were 10 explicit prosecutable cases of Donald Trump committing violations of the law by obstructing justice, that when Merrick Garland came into office, he chose to ignore those. And now I think the statute of limitations has run out on them. I believe it was a 5-year statute of limitations. He had that first year, he could have prosecuted those. Why? Why is it that on October 30th, 2016, Harry Reid, then the head of the Senate Democrats and of the Senate, wrote a letter to Jim Comey saying it's clear that you have in your possession information about the connection between Trump and Russia and are refusing to release it. Yet you rushed out this information that you were going to investigate Hillary Clinton, and there was no there. Why is this? There's a video with the entire letter from Harry Reid over at thomhartmann.com. Check it out. And welcome back. 51 minutes past the hour. Jackie in Bellevue, Washington. Hey, Jackie, thanks for listening to KBCS. What's up?
Good morning. Happy Monday, Tom. How are you?
Thank you. Back at you. I'm fine. What's up?
Great. Okay. I just wanted to say I only caught a little bit of what you said. I think I've heard it before, and I haven't read it, but it doesn't mean I am doubting you at all on Putin and rape, as you said it. I think that's...
It has been documented.
Probably.
The soldiers are being sent into combat with condoms, specifically to rape people.
Okay, here's where I'm going. And I think it's good to point these things out, as painful as it is. But this is also a fact. The United States has a culture of rape. 1 in 6 women in our country has experienced a violent attempt for rape, and the others have had a complete and absolute sexual assault. So it's not just a Russian phenomenon here, is my point. But I'm not finished, please.
Nobody in the United States is arguing that rape should be used against women as a tool of genocide. Nobody, to the best of my knowledge. Yes, rape is a problem in the United States. But in Ukraine, you have another country that is using rape as a weapon of war.
Okay. So we have to look at this, though. We have to look at ourselves just a little bit, because Iraqi female detainees in 2003, there were many incidents of rape.
We have done, terrible things in Iraq, Jackie. George W. Bush was a war criminal. I'm not defending any of that, but again, if you're throwing this stuff in the context of Ukraine, I'm not having it. Reed, hey Reed, what's on your mind today?
Hi, I was wondering your opinion. By the way, thanks for being you. Your opinion on this head security officer being scrutinized for dealing with the Russians. And I'm wondering, why has the case with Moscow Mitch and his deal with the aluminum factory and all of that, and actually they changed dropped some of the restrictions on Deripaska, I believe. Mm-hmm. And now I don't hear anything more about Moscow Mitch and the collusion deal that he struck with Russia.
Yeah, Moscow Mitch McConnell helped Deripaska get the sanctions against him lifted so that he could come into Kentucky just in time for the election and claim that he was going to build a $200 million aluminum factory there. As soon as the election was over and Mitch McConnell and Rand Paul, who were both, claiming they had some role in this, and Rand Paul, of course, the guy who carried a packet of top secret documents from Donald Trump to personally hand deliver to Vladimir Putin in Moscow on a flight all by himself. Once these guys were safely reelected, Deripaska pulled out and said, no, I'm not going to do this anymore. And it turns out that Deripaska and one of his buddies was apparently the guy who was, conveying information, who brought in the guy that Paul Manafort owed money to, that he was trying to work off this money by running the Trump campaign on behalf of Putin in 2016, or in 2015, actually, the primary campaign. And, the whole thing is just insanely sketchy. And I am hopeful that we will discover in due course, in due time, just how much the Russians actually inserted themselves into our election in 2016. We're getting some very, very troubling signs. Reed, thanks for the call. Sarah in Fort Worth, Texas. Hey, Sarah, what's up?
Hey, Tom, you've got so many trolls today. You've got to be doing the right thing.
They're quite enthusiastic.
They are crazy. I mean, the last couple, I was screaming at the phone, looking at you on the television. It's like, no. Yeah. But my question, so we have the Hague in place. Why does it have to get so bad? And why do all these people have to be subject to these atrocities when there is a mechanism to stop it? I don't understand. It's driving me nuts.
Yeah, well, arguably the international mechanism would be the United Nations, and because Russia has a veto on the Security Council, the United Nations has been rendered impotent essentially. The court in The Hague.
Why are they not kicked out?
I beg your pardon?
I said, why aren't they kicked out?
There's not not an easy mechanism for this. This was the compromise that was necessary at the creation of the United Nations to get countries like the Soviet Union to participate in it. We'll give you some power and we'll give you this veto authority because we're going to do everything by consensus. With regard to the court in The Hague, yes, they can prosecute, and if Kamala Harris went to Europe last week and came right out and said, these people are war criminals and we will hold them to account. I'm fully expecting that we will. It's just, again, it takes time.
Quickly, I will say is that, I think all of these people are counting on that they are white old males with a whole lot of money and they have no worries.
Yeah, it may be. It may be. Sarah, thank you for the call. Up next, Naomi Oreskes is going to drop by how corporations hooked America on the myth of the magic of the marketplace. Fascinating new piece here. Stick around.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
In addition to bringing you the Thom Hartmann Program here on Free Speech TV and Video Media Online, we also have a whole set of ways you can interact with us and tools you can use to spread the word about the importance of democracy and the threats to it in our republic. First, there's your daily homework. Sue Nethercutt puts together a daily email newsletter that has a link to every story I discuss on the air, so you can find my sources and you can share them with your friends. It's free and you can sign up at thomhartmann.com. Second, I publish my daily take every day over at the hartmannreport.com website. That's also free if you want the daily 5 days a week rant in your inbox. No ads either. We have the podcasts. There's the free 1-hour version of our daily show that's advertising supported. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts normally. And then there's also the podcast of the entire 3-hour show with no advertisements, and that's available by subscription over at thomhartmann.com. So check them all out at thomhartmann.com and hartmannreport.com.
We say fight back!
Club book for today is Talk Radio's America by Brian Rosenwald, subtitled How an Industry Took Over a Political Party That Then Took Over the United States. This is from the introduction. August 1, 1988 marked the beginning of the long road to President Donald Trump. But even political junkies took little notice of the fateful events that unfolded that day as a failed disc jockey and former Kansas City Royals executive named Rush Hudson Limbaugh III made his national radio debut. Only a small audience tuned in. So poorly commemorated was the moment that we don't even know how many stations broadcast day one of Limbaugh's syndicated program. Limbaugh claims the show began on 56 affiliates, while other counts range from 57 and 87. From the beginning, the show was brash, entertaining, controversial, and boundary-pushing. Before Limbaugh, this sort of programming did not exist outside major cities. In 1983, there were just 59 talk radio stations nationwide, and the program on many of those stations consisted of advice shows, staged interviews, and caller-driven discussions of everything from neighborhood schools to abominable snowmen. Most talk radio programming focused on local concerns, and most of the industry's stars, such as Larry King and Sally Jesse Raphael, had left-of-center views but rarely shared them. At the time of Limbaugh's national debut, talk radio had negligible political impact. Hotbeds such as Boston, hosts might influence local and statewide policy debates, especially on visceral issues such as seatbelt laws. But talk radio was not a partisan force, and it had no role in national politics. In fact, the wall-to-wall conservative political talk stations that dominate the AM airwaves today were impossible until 1987, thanks to a regulation called the Fairness Doctrine. That year, however, the Federal Communications Commission eliminated the policy, which required broadcasters of opinionated programming on controversial issues to offer an array of viewpoints. In this more permissive environment, Limbaugh would go on to revolutionize the radio business. In doing so, he helped unintentionally to spawn a major new political player. Within a decade, the broadcast format he inaugurated aired on more than 1,000 stations and kept millions company as they commuted, worked, and shouted back at their radios. It took just a few years before conservative talk radio began to influence national politics and public policy. That influence only grew throughout the decades as the business changed. Over the course of the 1990s and early 2000s, the number of nationally syndicated talk shows rose dramatically, and the content of talk radio programs became increasingly political and conservative. Liberal pundits and some scholars agree on the broad outlines of the story. Conservative station executives, conspiring with their Republican allies, built a format modeled on Limbaugh's program, and thousands of Limbaugh wannabes cropped up all over the country. Executives, hosts, and politicians turned talk radio into an appendage of the Republican Party, using the platform to get Republicans elected and advance the party's agenda. The success of talk radio led to the development of partisan and ideological cable news networks, and some hosts complemented their radio shows with primetime cable programs. Eventually, this content found a home in the new digital sphere, with equally strident cheerleaders proliferating on blogs and other online publications. This narrative makes sense, especially to liberals. After all, many conservative media executives and their corporate political action committees donate to Republican candidates, and most hosts champion conservative candidates and causes. But this narrative is wrong. In reality, the story of talk radio's emergence as a popular conservative format and the impact it had on American politics weaves together two, But this narrative is wrong. In reality, the story of talk radio's emergence as a popular conservative format and the impact it had on American politics weaves together two distinct, complex tales. Neither has anything to do with the conspiracy to create a media servant of the Republican Party. The first describes how talk radio spread across America, in the process saving AM radio from financial ruin. Limbaugh had no intention of affecting elections or legislation, and no inkling that he could. Nor did any of his early successors. The executives who gave these hosts a chance also had no interest in political outcomes. Hosts and their bosses were in business. They wanted to captivate listeners and make money, and they discovered, essentially by accident, that conservative political talk in the mouth of an entertaining personality achieved this. Conservative hosts had strong opinions, but their primary goal was, and still is, financial gain. And it is because they realized financial gain that more and more stations invested in their style and content while divesting from competing formats. The second story concerns talk radio's transformation after 1995 into an almost entirely conservative and doctrinaire medium that eventually spawned successors in other media, took over the Republican Party, and reshaped it in hosts' and listeners' image. Limbaugh was a great innovator, but he didn't change American media and politics all at once or on his own. In conservative talk radio's early days, hosts shared stations with liberal talkers and apolitical programs. There was not an immediate sense that conservative radio was the future either. But gradually, its success snowballed thanks to trial and error in the radio business, regulatory changes, political events, happenstance, and most importantly, listener behavior. Hosts also got a boost from marginalized conservative Republican politicians who realized that talk radio would enable them to circumnavigate the mainstream media, and deliver their message directly to voters. The book, Talk Radio's America.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And welcome back to the third hour of our program. On the line with us, Naomi Oreskes, the professor of history of science at Harvard University, a co-author with Eric Conway of The Big Myth, a new book, How American Business Taught Us to Loathe Government and Love the Free Market, a brilliant piece of work. Naomi Oreskes, Oreskes on Twitter. And of course, the book is available wherever you find books. Their previous book is Merchants of Doubt, by the way, which we've talked about on this program. Naomi, welcome to the program. Tell us about how corporate America at what point in time did corporate America first start this laissez-faire, neoliberal, Friedman and Hayek type of sales pitch? Did it precede the meetings in Switzerland and the 1936 meeting in France?
Yes, our book covers more than 100 years of history. What we show in the book is that the construction of the myth of the magic of the marketplace actually begins in the early 20th century. And the book you were just talking about a minute ago is a good lead into ours. In the late 19th century, American capitalism was rapacious. The free market had actually led to the destruction of competition and the rise of giant monopolies and trusts. And it had also led to massive exploitation of workers, including child labor. And so reformers in the late 19th and early 20th century, what's often referred to as the progressive era, reformers that included both progressive Republicans and Democrats, worked to try to make American capitalism more civilized, to protect competition through the Sherman and Clayton Antitrust Acts, and to protect workers through the development of workmen's compensation and laws against child labor.
These were like Republicans, Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft.
Yes, exactly. Many of these reformers were progressive Republicans. Teddy Roosevelt's an important person in the story. Gifford Pinchot, the governor of Pennsylvania and the first director of the Forest Service. And in response to these attempts at reform, American business tried to fight back. And they tried to fight back by starting the beginnings of what would become a 100-year-long propaganda campaign to deny the appropriate role of government in the marketplace, to deny the appropriate role of government in protecting workers and in protecting competition, and to tell a myth, to construct a myth that markets were wise, that markets were efficient, and we should just trust the marketplace to make appropriate decisions on our behalf.
I find it an extraordinary leap of illogic, I suppose, that marketplaces cannot exist outside of simple barter without a government. You have to have government to define the currency and the value of the currency. You have to have government to define the rules of what is a legitimate versus a fraudulent transaction. You have to have government to provide a mechanism for redress when someone is the victim of fraud. It's like suggesting that we could play, the National Football League could play football without rules. That if the rule was just that whichever team gave the most money to the NFL got to have an extra player on the field and could ignore, any 3 random rules they wanted or something like that. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. How
exactly?
How could they sell this?
Well, so the core of the myth is the construction of the notion of the free market, the idea that there could even be such a thing as a free market that exists apart from society. So as you say, markets have been around since time immemorial. We know there were markets in ancient Greece and Rome and ancient Assyria. As far as we can tell, there have been markets as long as there has been human civilization, and they have always had rules and regulations because markets don't exist apart from the societies that they're part of. They're a human mechanism, and like any human activity, whether it's football or driving a car, we have rules about how these activities should take place. You can even find rules about markets in the Old Testament. But the myth, the construction of the myth, begins with the idea that there even could be such a thing as the free market, which exists unto itself, which has wisdom, and which is anthropomorphized even into a sort of godlike character, so that when we talk about the invisible hand of the marketplace, the implication is that the market is almost godlike. And so we should trust in the marketplace in a kind of quasi-religious fashion. And that's why we refer to this ideology as market fundamentalism, because it has this quasi-religious, faith-based component.
And that phrase, the invisible hand of the marketplace, comes from Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. It only occurs once in that book. It occurs in the context of what arguably is an argument for protective trade policy, essentially, and it completely, the way it's been misused and misinterpreted. I know you're right about this in your book, The Big Myth. We're talking with Naomi Oreskes. It completely contradicts not only much of Wealth of Nations, but almost all of A Theory of Moral Sentiments, which really was Adam Smith. That was the work he was most proud of and probably most well known for, at least at the time of the American Revolution. Where did this begin? I mean, was it? I know, Reagan was pushing this stuff, and you read about this, with the General Electric Theater and traveling around the country. General Motors was reprinting a cartoon version of Hayek's book and sending them out to people. Did this really get rolling in a big way in the United States in the 1950s? Was that the era?
No, it's actually much earlier. So the story begins in the early 20th century with arguments over child labor and workmen's compensation. Right. Many people today don't really realize how violent, how deadly, how dangerous American capitalism was. Millions of American workers were killed or injured on the job every year, and they received no recompense. So workmen's compensation was a reform put in place to make workplaces safer, because it was found that when business leaders, when factory owners had to pay premiums into a workman's compensation system, it gave them an incentive to make the workplace safer. So this was a positive reform that worked. It made workplaces safer and more efficient. But a lot of business leaders opposed it because they saw it as an infringement on their rights, their prerogatives, their freedoms. And so they begin this campaign to construct a story about capitalism and freedom, to claim that any compromise of economic freedom, any compromise of the rights of businessmen, factory owners to run their businesses as they saw fit, would put us on a kind of slippery slope to Soviet-style totalitarianism. Now, how can they make this story work when it's so obviously self-interested and when the facts support it? Well, because the facts don't support it, because the evidence doesn't support it, they have to try to shore it up. And one of the ways they do that is by recruiting academics. And so they recruit two of the founders of neoliberalism, the Austrian economists Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich von Hayek, and they bring them to America and they begin to promote their work in the 1930s and 40s. And in the 1930s, von Mises serves as a consultant to one of the leading trade organizations in the United States, the National Association of Manufacturers, who are key, and by the way, are still a key player today in denying climate change and blocking climate action. So they recruit them, they bring them to America, and they begin to promote a kind of bowdlerized version of their views. So if you actually read von Hayek's most famous book, The Road to Serfdom, published in 1944, you may or may not agree with it, but it's a pretty sophisticated book. It's pretty thoughtful. And one of the things that von Hayek says is, well, there are places where it is appropriate for the government to be engaged in the marketplace. For example, preventing deforestation, preventing the harmful effects of pollution, or possibly even some form of social insurance to help workers. Remember, this is coming out of the Great Depression, to help workers in cases of extreme need. So Hayek is ideological. The work is a piece of ideology, but he's not a nut. Mm-hmm. But in the hands of his American acolytes, he becomes a kind of nut. They produce a Reader's Digest version of his work that takes out all the caveats about how you actually do need laws against pollution and deforestation, and you actually do need social insurance. And they turn him into this very flattened, very one-sided, one-dimensional advocate of, free markets, über alles, and government is evil, government is bad. And that's the piece of the story that then they propagandize.
Right, and then Reagan and friends carry it forward. How do we push back on this? What's the most effective counter narrative or counter story, or have you encountered?
Well, I think that mold grows in dark places, and all of my work has really been about shedding light on important social, political, and scientific issues. So one of the things we learned when we wrote Merchants of Doubt, which is a book about climate change denial, is that when you explain to people that climate change denial isn't about the science, that it's a political claim and it's not supported by the evidence, and that it's actually kind of a con trying to persuade people that somehow the interest of ExxonMobil is the interest of us. When you expose that, a lot of people say, oh, wow, I didn't know that. And nobody wants to be on the losing end of a con. Nobody wants to be a sucker. And so I think we have a somewhat similar story here. This is a story of a 100-year-long propaganda campaign to persuade the American people to trust big business to have our backs when the history shows that they don't. And so I think that when people begin to understand that this is propaganda, it makes them see it in a different light. And it's interesting because most of us, when we hear the word propaganda, we think government propaganda. But what we haven't really realized is that there's also big business propaganda. And this is a story about business propaganda that has been highly impactful, highly influential, and has really stood in the way of a lot of important reforms that we need today to fight problems like the climate crisis, the opioid crisis, income inequality, the lack of affordable housing, and so many other issues that really affect the lives of the American people.
Yeah, it truly is. The book is The Big Myth, the subtitle, How American Business Taught Us to Loathe Government and Love the Free Market, by Naomi Oreskes and Eric M. Conway. Available wherever fine books are available. Merchants of Doubt, the preceding book. Naomi, thank you so much for dropping by and sharing this conversation and these insights with us. Thank you.
You're welcome.
It's a pleasure having you on. We'll be right back at 17 minutes past the hour here on the Thom Hartmann Program. We got a crazy alert about Fox News right after this.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Stick around. We'll be right back. And welcome back. Michael in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. Hey, Michael, it's Bear, right? Or Bar?
Wilkes-Barre.
Wilkes-Barre. Okay. All right. What's up, Michael?
Yeah. Well, I have to say, first of all, I really enjoyed listening to your author guest. The book sounds extremely fascinating.
Yeah, she's good. She knows what she's talking about. And it looks like a great book.
Yes. And my head's ready to explode from all the people carrying water for Putin today. I just can't believe where all this stuff is coming from.
Yeah, I should probably start filtering them out. But you know, we now have fewer than, you know, only 48% of Americans now continue to support military aid for Ukraine, which is, I think, a real testimonial. The Russian trolls have been very, very active on Twitter and on Facebook in particular. You know, selling this idea that somehow America started it, that we overthrew the government in Ukraine back in the day, and, you know, which is, I mean, as if it was Iran all over again, and it very much is not. And, oh my God, Victoria Nuland. And, you know, there's all these various mythologies that are associated with this, but they're all BS. I mean, what it comes down to is Putin decided he wanted Ukraine, and he was going to take it, and he thought he could take it in 2 days, and he miscalculated. Now he's a year into a war, and he's killed tens of thousands of people, and is just fine with that.
Do you know what was the spark that caused the Ukrainian people to rise up against Yanukovych originally?
I don't recall.
The spark was that Yanukovych wouldn't sign legislation to make Ukraine an associate member of the EU.
Oh, really? I thought it was that they thought that the election had been rigged, because the exit poll results did not correspond to the counted results.
Well, that was the firewood, but the spark that set off the firewood was the EU issue.
I see. Interesting. Huh. Yeah, I'm not surprised. I mean, the people of Ukraine have, by and large, I mean, there are Russian-speaking areas to the east, the Donbass, the famous Donbass, you know, where arguably many, if not perhaps even a majority of the people, Crimea as well, are just fine with being part of Russia, or at least were. I mean, they may be reconsidering that now, but given everything that's going on. But by and large, the people of Ukraine want to be Europeans. They want to be part of Europe.
Yes, and it's their right to determine, not to have anyone determine that for them.
I'm with you. Yep. Thank you for that, Michael. Appreciate the call. From Michael to Michael. This Michael is in North Las Vegas, Nevada. Hey, Michael, what's up?
Hey, Tom. Can you hear me now?
Just fine. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you for taking my call.
I just wanted to mention that Jimmy Carter was my governor when I was younger, growing up in Georgia, and they let us out of school to see his train going to D.C. to become president. And
oh, wow.
I remember that. Yeah, that was quite a treat. And, you know, we felt like he was one of us because, you know, he's from South Georgia, and he was the first governor, I believe, that the black Georgians had considered one of theirs. And, yeah, it was quite a treat. And also, real quick, do you think that him not embracing the Democratic leadership led to Ted Kennedy primarying him in 1980?
I'm not real sure. I think Ted Kennedy just thought this was his last chance, but I'm not that much of a scholar of that particular moment in history. Richard, I got to run, or Michael, I got to run. Thank you for the call. Change starts with you. You can be calling your Democratic or Republican representatives to let them know what you think by calling 202-224-3121. It's the Capitol switchboard. It'll get you right through to them. And welcome back. It's 22 minutes past the hour. Dennis in San Diego. Hey, Dennis, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom. First-time caller.
Thank you.
You know, you had the state rep on a little while ago.
Yeah, he was the chair of the Wisconsin Democratic Party, Ben Wickler.
That's what it was. Yeah, I couldn't look back and see who it was. But anyway, he was talking about the Uline family running in politics there. And I wanted to point out that family, I believe I read it in the Atlantic, they're Christian supremacists, but they're also the largest distributor of office and warehouse supplies in the country. It's, you know, the catalog you get in the mail, you probably have one in your eyesight, Uline, L-I-N-E, big, crazy, nutbag Trumper family and Christian supremacists. So it's quite interesting stuff.
Yeah, and they're billionaires, and they've got, you know, a very successful business. You're absolutely right, Dennis. Yeah.
Yeah, and everybody uses them. You order a hand truck or, you know, your water or whatever, you use that company. They're everywhere. So just thought it interesting.
Okay, Dennis, thanks. Thanks for the call, and thanks for the info, and thanks for listening to Sirius XM. David in Portland. Hey, David, what's on your mind today?
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up that I think it's wrong that Biden's committing to more, tanks and weapons. Well, Palestine, East Palestine, Ohio, is completely engulfed. The people in the CDC are saying it's okay to go back. And he just went out there and committed more money. And meanwhile, the people were told to go back to their houses, and it's completely small.
Okay, it's another tanky. Keep trying, guys. Tony in Long Island, New York. Hey, Tony, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom, the trolls just keep on coming, huh?
Yeah. It's,
hey, brother,
you give them an A for effort.
I hear you, man. Two things real quick. Okay, first thing regarding Naomi, she was extremely interesting before regarding her book, but I think she may have gleaned over one particular facet why the public is going to be very it's going to be hard to push back, to get the public to push back on corporations. And I think that's because once corporations started going public and people are invested in 401ks, and now they have a fiduciary interest in seeing these companies thrive, I think that's going to be another facet that's going to cause it to be a little bit more painful to push back against them.
How so?
I mean, well, because now people that have 401ks, now they have a fiduciary interest in, say, a petroleum company or whatnot. Right. They want to see them thrive. They want to see them grow. Otherwise, the amount of money that they make in their 401k dwindles.
That's right. So that's why they're supporting or tolerating anyway, stock buybacks, for example, because some little tiny benefit comes to them. Yeah, it's a good point. And I believe that the whole IRA thing began with, wasn't that the Reagan administration that started that as a way of, carving a hole out of Social Security?
1982, you're correct.
Yeah, that was my recollection. Okay, Tony, thank you for that.
But regarding your gentleman had some information regarding, I guess, the train that was crashed, and he was kind of pushing back against you with the braking system.
Yeah.
And number one, I work with a company called Twinkle Precision, and they manufacture these electronic braking systems for the MTA in New York. Okay, so they do stop extremely quickly. That's number one. And number two, we wouldn't even have this problem had not this country bought into maglev, or basically high-speed rail, which was created 10 miles away from me at Brookhaven National Laboratory. And I actually knew one of the scientists who was part of a crew of 25 scientists that created it. He passed away 5 years ago. Once they created it, they went to every metropolitan. They went from the MTA in New York City to Chicago to Miami to San Francisco. They went to every major city, and everyone pushed back against it. And there are 4 reasons why nobody wanted it, and we still don't have it to this day. The petrochemical, the petrol industry pushed back against it. The aerospace industry pushed back against it. Car manufacturers pushed back against it, and the politicians getting paid off pushed back against it.
Amazing, amazing. And you know, China built a high-speed rail from the equivalent of Chicago to New York, almost the exact same distance in 2 years. I mean, it's like the whole country's covered with high-speed rail now, and we don't even have a single one of any consequence. Tony, thank you for that. Thank you for that information. That's great. Appreciate the call. We'll be right back.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
So are you support? I've had a number of calls, trash talking our involvement in Ukraine. I'm curious, are you supportive of being in Ukraine?
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Our book.
It's Thom Hartmann University Book Club. In the weeks after 9/11, Rodale Press reached out to a bunch of folks, me, the Dalai Lama, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Rabbi David Wolpe, Thich Nhat Hanh, Chuck Colson, Neil Donald Walsh, and asked for thoughts about a spiritual response to the attack on America. The result was a book, From the Ashes. And this is from the chapter that I wrote, The Goddess of Democracy, a Sacred Archetype to Heal the World. People argue that the terrorist attacks against the United States reflect a war between one religion and another, or between the poor and rich of the world. While there may be an element of truth to each, I'd suggest that the real war here is between the 11th century and the 21st century. And while our leaders, and until our leaders figure that out, we may miss some great opportunities. Back in the Dark and Middle Ages, the Catholic Church ruled Europe. Women were often forbidden to go out in public unless properly covered, and were explicitly the property of men. Justice was swift and severe, ranging from disfigurement to torture to death in horrific ways, and most often meted out with the approval or supervision of clerics. The power behind the power of all the royal families of Europe was the Pope. On November 27th, 1095, Pope Urban gave one of history's most famous speeches to the Council of Clermont in France, calling for a holy war against Islam to unite factious Europe. Dr. E.L. Skip Knox of Boise State University in Idaho summarized the Pope's speech. The noble race of Franks must come to the aid of their fellow Christians in the East. The infidel Turks are advancing into the heart of Eastern Christendom. Christians are being oppressed and attacked. Churches and holy places are being defiled. Jerusalem is groaning under the Saracen yoke. The Holy Sepulchre is in Muslim hands and has been turned into a mosque. The Franks must stop their internal wars and squabbles. Let them go instead against the infidel and fight a righteous war. God himself will lead them, for they will be doing his work. There will be absolution and remission of sins for all who die in the service of Christ. Here they are poor and miserable sinners. There they will be rich and happy. Let none hesitate. They must march next summer. God wills it. Thus began a war between two different medieval cultures, 11th century and 11th century Muslim. Over the next few centuries, the Catholics, with their battle cry of Deus Vult, God wills it, were often victorious against the Muslims, whose only crime defined by the Pope was that they were living in the Holy Land of the Catholic Church. Medieval historian Raymond of Aguilles wrote the following eyewitness account of the attack and seizure of Jerusalem in 1099 by the triumphant Christian crusaders. Quote, some of our men cut off the heads of their enemies. Others shot them with arrows so they fell from the towers. Others tortured them longer by casting them into the flames. Piles of heads, hand, and feet were to be seen in the streets of the city. It was necessary to pick one's way over the bodies of men and horses. But these were small matters compared to what happened at the Temple of Solomon, a place where religious services were ordinarily chanted. What happened there? If I tell the truth, it will exceed your powers of belief. So let it suffice to say this much at least, that in the temple and portico of Solomon, men rode in blood up to their knees and bridle reins. End of quote. In the 900 or so years since the early Crusades, both Christianity and Islam have undergone profound changes. The Protestant Reformation shook Christianity to its core, and the Renaissance in Europe wrought huge transformations in both Christianity and Judaism. Perhaps the most critical change came about in the 18th century when Jefferson, Madison, Franklin, and others synthesized the highest ideals of Greek, Roman, and Iroquois thought and culture to create the United States of America. In doing that, they ignited the flame of liberty, bringing into the world an archetype that to this day inspires hope worldwide. As America grew and our ideas of Republican democracy spread around the world, further transformations of the world took place. Another turning point was when modern science challenged the medieval worldview of the church in the Scopes monkey trial of 1925. Although Clarence Darrow lost that case, its widespread publicity began a dramatic and lasting process of change across the world. The American dream is a powerful and pervasive force in the world, even if the sometimes imperialistic behavior of our transnational corporations is often at odds with our own ideals. That dream has wafted over the entire world and is still so powerful that people are willing to die for it. In China, the Tiananmen Square protesters marched to their doom in 1989, carrying a 37-foot-tall papier-mâché replica of the Statue of Liberty, which they had named the Goddess of Democracy. Of course, there are still pockets of medieval perspective in the Christian world. The post-disaster comments of Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, who said they had just witnessed the wrath of their God, who had lifted the veil and allowed the terrorists God's anger over homosexuals, liberals, and the ACLU, reveals that such a worldview is still alive and well in a small fringe of Christianity. Some Christians are still today willing to commit terrorist acts of murder or mass murder. Timothy McVeigh and those who murdered numerous abortion providers all claim their acts are grounded in Christianity and biblical teachings. And just as 21st century Christianity still has its own pockets of medieval worldview, so does 21st century Islam. And then it gets into, how these reformations happen and, what we hope to see in among those right-wing crazies in Islam. The book is From the Ashes, a spiritual response to the attack on America.
Share the Thom Hartmann Program with your friends. We're available on SiriusXM, Free Speech TV, Pacifica, commercial stations nationwide, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, on the Thom Hartmann app, and you can even tell your smart speaker to listen to the Thom Hartmann Program. And welcome back. It's 34 minutes past the hour. Crazy alert. Fox thinks diversity is the cause of the train derailment in Ohio? Yep, sure enough. Laura Ingraham on Fox News, this via Media Matters, quote, "Now this is what happens when you prioritize diversity." She's talking about Pete Buttigieg, a gay man being in charge of the Department of Transportation. "Now this is what happens when you prioritize diversity and equity over competence and experience. America just ends up with a cabinet filled with nincompoops, radicals who point fingers instead of solving problems. And unfortunately for Ohio, the results may be deadly." Somebody needs to tell Laura that it was Donald Trump who deregulated the rail lines and not Pete Buttigieg. And then, to add to this, you've got Alex Jones now warning his millions of listeners and viewers that liberals are eating babies. And this was just, Sam Harris, the famous atheist and philosopher, was making this point about the demonization of people and whatnot. And he said, there are sometimes extra babies in the world and they're full of protein. Can't we eat them? This is not a conversation about eating babies. This is a conversation about how you can close the door to this idea that we both recognize as repellent and why we recognize it that way. And then he goes on to say, but there are people out there who say, hey, Sam Harris is a guy who wonders why we can't eat babies. So in other words, he wasn't arguing for eating babies at all. He was saying this is the kind of philosophical question that, you know, shouldn't even be a question. It's fairly black and white. But Alex Jones takes it out of context and goes into this. Oh, my God. All right. And a geeky science for you, too. This is fascinating. For the first time now, genetically modified trees have been planted in a U.S. forest. Now, typically, when you're going to experiment with genetically modified organisms, you have to do both lab experiments and real-world experiments, and even those have a degree of danger. I mean, the famous one was the Klebsiella planticola, when they modified this bacteria that lives in the roots of pretty much all plants on Earth to produce alcohol, thinking that they could, to convert carbohydrates from the roots into alcohol like yeast does. That, in fact, they took the gene out of yeast and added it to the Klebsiella planticola bacteria. And, you know, the thought was that we could use this, I'm going to sneeze, hang on, that we could use this to deal with agricultural waste products and things like that. Excuse me. And, it turned out that the bacteria killed the plants quite quickly, and had it gotten loose, it might have, ended all life on Earth. That would be the extreme situation, but it was not out of the realm of possibility. And that was a genetically modified organism. So we've gotten a little more careful about this. Well, there's a new company out of San Francisco, a biotech company, that has genetically modified poplars, which are kind of a semi-hardwood tree. They're not pines, they're not the softwoods, but they grow much faster, roughly twice as fast as normal trees. The Global Justice Ecology Project is worried about this. They say this is a growing threat to forests. And they point out that the company that is doing the genetically modified trees has not yet published a single peer-reviewed paper. All of its publicly reported results come from a greenhouse trial that lasted just a few months, and yet the trees are out there. Steve Strauss, a geneticist at Oregon State University, said, "My experience over the years is that the greenhouse means almost nothing about the outdoor prospects of trees." He said, "Venture capitalists may not know that." The company has been apparently quite successful at raising money for this. But, is it going to be a good thing for America or for the world? Who knows? And then finally, Marjorie Taylor Greene again. Here we go. Her tweets today. Today on our President's Day, Joe Biden, the President of the United States, chose Ukraine over America while forcing the American people to pay for Ukraine's government and war. I cannot express how much Americans hate Joe Biden. So here we've got Marjorie Taylor Greene, literally echoing Vladimir Putin's propaganda. And apparently this works in Republican circles because, these people will buy anything? Will believe anything? It's kind of sad because I'm seeing the same thing happen among, some people on the left who are just, suckers. They're buying into this propaganda, and it's we call them tankies because the same thing happened back in 1956 or 1965 when the Soviet tanks rolled into Czechoslovakia, and there were some people on the left in America who were like, "Oh no, don't worry about it. It's just this. The Soviet Union can do no wrong. After all, they're socialists, and we like socialism. They have free health care." Right. The Soviet Union was a fascist state. Let's just acknowledge that. Marjorie Taylor Greene goes on to say, Zelensky can't even wear a tie as he greets the President of the United States. He gladly takes our money in sweatshirts and T-shirts, but Biden is dressed up so insulting. America last. He went to Ukraine, a non-NATO nation whose leader's an actor and apparently now commanding our United States military to world war. We must impeach this American last fool before it's too late. Seriously? And this is like the great new hope for the GOP, Marjorie Taylor Greene, honest to God. All righty. Picking up some of your calls. Let's see here. Bob in Cardiff, California. Hey, Bob, what's on your mind today?
Yeah, Tom. Just about the Ukrainian thing, and I'm all for giving them every cent that we can possibly give them, but the only drawback is that we have to win.
I agree.
If we lose, the party is it's done.
Well, if we lose, it's going to be more consequential to the world than just the Democratic Party, because you're going to have war in Europe as Putin moves from Ukraine into Poland, and well, he's going to start with Moldova. He's already made that clear. I mean, this is a major expansion. He's trying to Catherine the Great. I mean, he's trying to reestablish the empire essentially. So
no, yeah, you are right, except from a selfish point of view. Just thinking of myself here in America and really afraid of the Republicans taking power is should they lose after giving them all that money, Biden's chances in 2024, I think, go way, way in the tank.
Yeah.
We just have to win. I hope that the better minds than mine know that if we give them enough, that the Russians will finally back off.
Yeah, I think we need to be helping them secure their airspace. I mean, that should have happened a long time ago, in my opinion. But yeah, I'm with you. Bob, thank you very much for the call. Mark in Ocala, Florida. Hey, Mark, what's up?
Hey, Tom. I spoke to you years ago. I'm a fellow Midwesterner, but I watch your show all the time. I don't call as much. But you did mention recently, Tom, about the fact that you had attended a law enforcement academy in Georgia, and I wanted to salute you. And I could just tell we had more in common. I've also attended an academy in South Florida. But I called the show as a former Marine because one of your questions was about, in fact, Ukraine. And not just because I'm a Marine do we support all wars, and I know that you realize that. I actually oppose the war in Iraq. But I do support this current administration stopping the expansion of the Vladimir Putin's attempt into Ukraine, Ukraine being a democratically elected president, even if it was a conservative. And Zelensky may be more conservative than me, but the point is it's not political for me. It's about what you just said, the expansion. If they roll into Moldova, they roll into Poland, or they roll into Germany, actually. So this is I was a combat engineer, Tom, in the Marine Corps, and I did an operation called Northern Wedding Bold Guard back in the 80s and in the late 80s. And they have bridges that are already pre-drilled and prefabbed and ready to be blown in place if the Russians were to roll through certain corridors. And the engineers, the Americans as well as the Germans, know right where the keys are kept on the bridge, and it's a very serious subject. Americans may not realize that. So I told your call screener, Tom, that the Paul Manafort had an association with American Marines. For all the right-wingers that are trying to sneak into your show right now, they're afraid to stand up to the Russians. You're actually listening to a Marine Corps veteran who's willing to still serve his country. I'm not afraid of Vladimir Putin or authoritarianism. Yeah. But Paul Manafort, who was involved with the rocking of buses of American, a small group of American Marines and sailors were like a landing party, a group that goes in before the main element. Mm-hmm. They'd gotten to a small town in Crimea in 2006. There's only about 150 Americans in a couple buses, and they were met with large crowds of very hostile people, and they were hit with rocks. The buses were, some of the Marines were injured, and so the Marines basically didn't confront. They weren't armed, with ammunition. They're probably in civilian clothes capacity with their weapons somewhere in tow, ultimately. Right. But nonetheless, they withdrew from the circumstances. They got out with their lives, in other words, and they escaped in the middle of the night. But Paul Manafort was working with Viktor Yanukovych at that time, and what I've just read here in the last few minutes, knowing the story, of course, he was on the payroll for about $20 million over the expanse of this association with Yanukovych. Yep. And I didn't catch the one caller that called the show earlier, Tom, trying to defend Yanukovych, who is a puppet for Vladimir Putin, a very rich puppet. Yeah. Yeah. So, I guess there are many. I think there's many Americans and maybe even some conservatives that would still stand up for the United States. And we didn't create NATO in 1985. NATO was something we inherited from defeating the Nazi fascists of 1945. So we inherited the world, and I'm not afraid to still step up. So that's
well, good on you, Mark. Good on you. Thank you. I recall Dwight Eisenhower saying words to the effect of any person who's ever been in combat is never pro-war, but if a war is what's necessary to defend freedom or defend your homeland, your country, you do what you have to do. And I'm assuming that's your perspective. Mark, thank you so much. Great to hear from you. Alfredo in Mountain View, California. Hey, Alfredo, what's on your mind today?
Hey, hi, Tom. How are you?
Good. What's up?
I personally think that Putin's days are a number. But I wanted to ask you about this Dominion lawsuit against Fox News.
Mm-hmm.
And this defamation lawsuit ending up in the Supreme Court, do you think? And possibly these guys just throwing the lawsuit away? And I take my answer off the air.
We'll see. The big, and I'm going to write about this for my op-ed tomorrow for Hartmann Report. The big, I believe, the big question, if it does go to the Supreme Court, let's say that Dominion prevails, because it looks like they've got a fairly strong case, and it does go to the Supreme Court. You have two members of the Supreme Court, Clarence Thomas and Neil Gorsuch, who have already come out and said, in the context of other opinions, in dissents, or in concurring opinions, that, and in other public venues, that they believe that New York Times v. Sullivan, or maybe it's the other way around, Sullivan v. New York Times. I think it's Times v. Sullivan. In any case, that's the case from the mid-'70s, as I recall, that established that that a public figure cannot sue for defamation. That, for example, if you were to publish an article saying that I eat babies or something, I could not sue you for defamation, even if we both knew that it wasn't true. I would have to prove that you had actual malice, that you were saying this with the intent of causing me a very specific harm, and it's really hard to prove. And so, if this goes before the Supreme Court, I think the biggest concern that I have is that Times versus Sullivan might get overturned, and that would completely change the landscape of American politics. In Australia, they don't have like the Times v. Sullivan. And there's this little progressive publication called Crikey, C-R-I-K-E-Y, that wrote an op-ed. I'll tell you about it in just a second.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
They had an op-ed that was arguing that the Murdoch family were unindicted co-conspirators, and they got sued for defamation and lost $1 million. And welcome back. Mike in Anchorage, Alaska. Hey, Mike, thanks for watching us on Free Speech. What's on your mind?
Hi, Tom. I want you to clearly define for me the difference between social democracy and democratic socialism.
I'm not sure there is a difference.
I've looked that up enough time to get myself confused, and now I can't even remember what Bernie is.
Yeah. Bernie refers to himself as a democratic socialist. He's done that many times on this program. And says that democratic socialism is the form of government that you find most clearly in Scandinavia, but also in most of your other European countries, maybe a little less clearly, and in some other countries around the world, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, Costa Rica, those kinds of countries. I'm not sure that the terms...
Those are the good guys.
Yeah. Basically that there is this clear definition of what is public and what is private. And, what are the public concerns? What are the things that should be the responsibility of government? And what are private concerns? What are the things that government should keep its nose out of? And in a democratic socialist country, the public concerns, the things that government should provide for people, include education, basically preschool to PhD or MD, health care, any kind of health care that you need throughout your life, including old age care and hospice care and things like that, and guarantees that there are reasonable terms for housing and employment and access to food and the basic necessities of life. And in the private realm, let people make their own decisions about things like, for example, abortion or who they're going to marry. Those are all consistent with democratic socialism, in my understanding and experience. Does that help?
So what is social democracy?
I think it's the same thing. I think it is. Both of them are democracy. Both of them are based in democracy. Both of them require the consent of the majority of the people to work. And both of them have a strong social safety net as their foundation. They have expanded the definition of society, of what government should be responsible for, of the social part that government's responsible for. So, Mike, I gotta move along, but thank you for the call. Patrick in East Lansing. Hey, Patrick, what's up?
Hey, Tom, I just wanted to tell you my wife was about 3 miles from that East Palestine, Ohio train derailment the day after it happened.
Uh-huh.
And we know lots of people in Mahoning County. We know 3 people who were first responders.
Mm-hmm.
And I just have to tell you, the story that we're hearing in the mainstream media doesn't even begin to tell us what's going on. And it's now been pretty widely reported in The Guardian and the New York Times. But there were 7 miles of streams with very large amounts of chemicals, and the federal law will not allow us to know how many hundreds of thousands of gallons went into those 7 streams. 1 million gallons spilled into the ditch, and they set it on fire and breached those containers because they didn't have the hardened cargo holds. You haven't covered that point. There's no federal data in which the derailments with toxic loads are disclosed on the website, and we get no data on toxic loads into rivers and streams. In Washington, there were 19,000 gallons of toxic chemicals. Now, Pete's saying that it's safe enough and getting safer, but Sherrod Brown and Josh Shapiro, our friends, are saying that we're not regulating, and he's saying he lacks the power. It's just not true.
Yeah, I agree. Patrick, I completely agree. And I think Buttigieg is falling down on the job here, frankly. Patrick, I got to run. Thank you for the call. Help support progressive radio. If you're listening to us on a commercial station, call their advertisers and let them know you're listening. If you're listening to us on Pacifica, or one of our many nonprofit stations, please support them when they do their fundraising drives. Thanks for supporting progressive talk radio, and tag you're it. And welcome back. 53 minutes past the hour. Ed in Erie, Michigan. Hey, Ed, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom, I always take you back, but today it's appropriate. Jimmy Carter was my first presidential vote, just a bit too young, in 72.
Mm-hmm.
And sorry, I had a little bit of a freezer. But anyway, as we talk about it, us old union guys now get stoned, it's legal in Michigan, and talk about them. I wanted your opinion. Some say, as we talk about them, Ford wasn't a bad. Ford was a good Republican. Okay, I think he passed that TRA. Did you remember that? It was called the Trade Readjustment Act.
Right.
The auto workers got when we got laid off. Do you remember that?
I do.
It was a stuff. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think it was Ford. Maybe.
Yeah, Jerry Ford was a moderate Republican. He was kind of a Dwight Eisenhower Republican.
Yeah, but
he
anyway,
drank the Kool-Aid.
Yeah.
He also signed some really good legislation restricting money in politics.
Yeah, but as we talk about, just looking back and it was just been thrown out there. As far as Reagan is concerned, maybe we would have been better off if Ford got elected, because he could have ran again in 8, and which probably would have eliminated Ronald Reagan. Well, what's your opinion of that?
I'm just not sure. Jerry Ford, the problem that both Ford and Carter had went back to the Arab oil embargo. The price of oil had just exploded, and so you had inflation, and then Jimmy Carter brought in Arthur Burns to run the Fed, and Burns took the top, pushed the top interest rates up into the high teens, and that was kind of the end. I was a young man. Yeah. Yeah, that was kind of the end of the Carter presidency.
Starting out at the factory. Yeah, and didn't know if I was going to get laid off. I started in January '73, and that Arab oil embargo started less than a year later.
Yep, talking about. Yeah. Ed, I got to run. I want to get another caller in here before the end of the hour, but thank you. Thank you, spot on. Mark in Toledo. Hey, Mark, what's up?
Hey, yeah, I just wanted to support Ukraine. I think part of the problem is too many Americans just think about America and not more globally. You know, like we're not the only ones supporting Ukraine. You know, European Union is supporting Ukraine. And a lot of them took a bigger risk because they're getting a lot of their, like Germany and Britain, because they're getting a lot of their energy supplies from Russia.
It's true.
So they took a big risk in defending Ukraine. And plus, a lot of European Union countries are taking in Ukrainian refugees. Mm-hmm. So I just, it's not just us. It's a big part of the world supporting Ukraine. I just don't think a lot of, especially right wing, really realizes that.
And I don't get why, when the Republican Party has been embracing Putin since the beginning of the Trump candidacy, basically, because Trump, was so tied into Putin. I mean, I'm convinced without Putin, Donald Trump never would have been president. And I don't get why lefties, I get anti-war, I was anti-war during the Vietnam War. I mean, you can be against wars, but I just don't get why they would be pro-Putin. It just continues to baffle me and sadden me. Mark, I got to run. Thank you so much for the call today. Thank you for being with us today. We'll be back tomorrow, same time, same place. In the meantime, don't forget, democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires all of us, includes you. So get out there, get active. Check out wisdems.org, by the way, the Wisconsin Democratic Party. Big election tomorrow, a bigger election in April. So get that on your radar screen. So get out there, get active, tag, you're it. We'll see you tomorrow. Have a great afternoon. Be good to yourself, the people around you.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
In addition to bringing you the Thom Hartmann Program here on Free Speech TV and Video Media Online, we also have a whole set of ways you can interact with us and tools you can use to spread the word about the importance of democracy and the threats to it in our republic. First, there's your daily homework. Sue Nethercutt puts together a daily email newsletter that has a link to every story I discuss on the air, so you can find my sources and you can share them with your friends. It's free and you can sign up at thomhartmann.com. Second, I publish my daily take every day over at the hartmannreport.com website. That's also free if you want the daily 5 days a week rant in your inbox. No ads either. Third, we have the podcasts. There's the free 1-hour version of our daily show that's advertising supported. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts normally. And then there's also the podcast of the entire 3-hour show with no advertisements, and that's available by subscription over at thomhartmann.com. So check them all out at thomhartmann.com and hartmannreport.com.
We say fight back!